Clay Barrett's laugh carried across the general store like something he'd rehearsed. Rowan Mercer sent away for a mail-order bride, he announced to no one and everyone at once, slapping his palm on the counter hard enough to rattle the glass jars. Got himself a fat one. Couldn't get a real woman, so he ordered the kind nobody else would take. He unfolded the paper in his hand. Someone had shown him the advertisement, or maybe he'd found it himself, the way men like Clay always seemed to find the things that could hurt other people most. And he read aloud in a high, mocking voice, "Capable woman sought for frontier ranch life. All constitutions welcome." He looked up, grinning at the two ranch hands lounging near the door. All constitutions, that's what they're calling it now. Nobody laughed, but nobody told him to stop either. That silence said everything about the kind of town Heller's Creek was. If you've ever been told you were too much, too loud, too heavy, too broken to be loved, stay with this story. Because the woman stepping off that wagon didn't know it yet, but she was about to change everything. Like this video, drop a comment with your city and country so I can see how far this story travels and follow along so you don't miss what happens next. Stories like this one don't come around often. This one earned its ending. Okay. The advertisement had been folded and unfolded so many times that the creases had gone soft, the paper worn thin at the corners like something handled by anxious hands in anxious moments. Mabel Ashcroft had found it tucked inside the back of a women's journal at the lending library in Cutter's Mill, and she had stood there in the narrow aisle between shelves for a long time before she pulled it free. Ash Hollow Ranch, Heller's Creek territory, seeking a capable woman of practical nature for partnership in frontier ranch life. Must be willing to work. Steady disposition valued over delicate constitution. Respond to R. Mercer, care of the Heller's Creek Post. She had read it 4 times. Then she had folded it once, cleanly, and slipped it into her coat pocket. That was 6 weeks before she boarded the wagon that would carry her west. She hadn't told anyone she was leaving. There was no one left to tell. Her mother had stopped speaking to her 3 years ago, after the incident with the chairs at her cousin Vera's wedding. The spindly decorated chairs that the venue provided, the ones that weren't built to hold a woman Mabel's size, and the way one of them had cracked beneath her during the reception and sent her sideways into the aisle, and the way Vera's mother had said loudly and without looking directly at Mabel, "Someone should have anticipated this." Her mother had laughed along with the rest of them, not cruelly, exactly, just automatically. The way people do when the other option is to stand up and cause a scene, and standing up costs more than they're willing to pay. Mabel had gotten up off the floor herself, smoothed her dress, walked to the punch table and poured herself a cup and stood there holding it until her hands stopped shaking. She had gotten very good at that, the smoothing and the standing and the holding until the shaking stopped. Thomas had come 2 years after that. Thomas with his gentle eyes and his patient way of listening, and the 3 months of courtship that had felt for the first time in Mabel's adult life like being seen. He had never once mentioned her weight. He had held her hand in public. He had brought her flowers from his mother's garden, not the expensive kind from a shop, but the real kind, slightly wilted from being carried a long distance, which somehow meant more. She had believed him. That was the part she kept returning to in the weeks after he left. Not the cruelty of what he'd done, but the completeness of her own belief. She had let herself be certain. The note he'd left was 7 words long, written in his careful schoolteacher's handwriting, on the back of the envelope that had contained his mother's address. "A man can't build a future with a woman like you." She'd read it standing in the doorway of the boarding house room she'd been renting on Calvert Street, still in her dressing gown, the morning light coming in gray and cold through the single window. She read it once. Then she folded it and put it in the wood stove and watched it burn. She didn't cry. She had already done her crying for that particular variety of grief, the kind that comes from believing in someone who was, it turned out, only practicing. What she felt instead, watching that paper curl and blacken, was something quieter and more terrible than grief. It was certainty. The confirmation of a thing she had known, somewhere below her ribs, for most of her life, that she was a woman people left. Not because she was cruel, not because she was stupid or lazy or mean-spirited. She was none of those things, and she knew it. She was left because her body offended people's sense of what a woman should be, and in a world where that sense was law, she would always be in violation of it. She had found the advertisement 8 days later. The wagon west was crowded and uncomfortable and smelled like damp wool and horse. Mabel sat in the back with a tin trunk that contained everything she owned: 2 good dresses, 1 working dress, a winter coat, her mother's recipe book, which her mother didn't know she'd kept, a small pouch of dried lavender, and the letter she'd written to R. Mercer of Ash Hollow Ranch, along with his brief reply. His reply had been 5 sentences. Miss Ashcroft, I received your letter. The position is still available. I run cattle and some grain. The work is real and the winters are hard. If you're willing, come. Not a single word about her appearance. She had described herself plainly in her own letter because she had learned through years of hard experience that it was better to name the thing herself than to have someone else name it with more damage. She had written, I am a large woman and I will not pretend otherwise. I am also a capable one. His 5 sentences had not addressed that paragraph at all. Simply moved past it like it was information received and processed and set aside in favor of the relevant details. She was not sure whether that was kindness or indifference, and she'd spent the first 3 days of the wagon journey trying to decide which one she was hoping for. By the 4th day, she'd stopped trying to decide. She was going regardless. The other women on the wagon were traveling to join husbands, mostly, or to reach family in the territories. There was a young woman named Dottie, no older than 19, who talked almost constantly about a man named Hector, who had gone west to start a sheep operation and was waiting for her in a town called Bramblewood. Dottie was small and bright-faced and nervous in the way that young people sometimes are when they're happy. Like happiness itself is a thing that might be taken from them at any moment. She sat next to Mabel for most of the 2nd day and told her everything about Hector, his sheep, his stubbornness, the way he cried at the end of books. And Mabel listened to all of it with the particular attention she'd developed over years of being the kind of woman other people talked to rather than talked with. She was good at listening. She had always been good at listening. On the 2nd evening, when the wagon made camp near a creek, Dottie said, without preamble and without cruelty, Are you nervous about meeting him? Some, Mabel said. Me too. Dottie pulled her knees to her chest. I keep thinking, what if I'm not what he expected? Mabel looked at the fire for a moment. I think that's the risk everyone takes. Do you think he'll like you? It was the kind of question a 19-year-old asks because she hasn't yet learned which questions cost something to answer. Mabel didn't hold it against her. I think he'll see what I am, she said. What he does with that is his business. Dottie seemed to find this satisfying in some way she couldn't quite articulate because she nodded seriously and then changed the subject to Hector's sheep again, and Mabel was glad of it. She reached Heller's Creek on the 14th day, an hour after sunset, with dust in her hair and her back aching in a specific way that suggested the wagon's bench had done some permanent damage to something in her lower spine. The driver left her at the edge of a property marked by a fence post with a burned-in brand, A Hollow, stylized, the letters pressed deep into the wood. Ranch is up that way, the driver said, jerking his thumb toward a line of lights a quarter-mile distant. You need help with your trunk? No, Mabel said, because she never said yes to that question anymore, having learned that offers of help were sometimes offers of pity and sometimes offers of entertainment, and she could no longer reliably tell the difference. She sat on her trunk at the edge of the road for a moment after the wagon pulled away. The night was cold and very quiet. She could hear cattle somewhere in the dark, the occasional low sound of them moving. The sky was enormous out here in a way that it wasn't in Cutter's Mill, where buildings interrupted it and smoke filled in the gaps. Out here, the sky went all the way down to the horizon on every side, and the stars were so numerous they seemed almost excessive, like someone had been careless with them. She stood up, picked up her trunk by its handles, started walking. She had managed perhaps 100 yards when she heard boots on the ground behind her, approaching at a steady pace. She turned. A man. Tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat that had been worked in and a hat that had been rained on. He was walking towards her from the direction of the barn, and he moved like a man who spent most of his time outdoors, not hurried, not leisurely, just purposeful, like the ground beneath his feet was a thing he trusted. He stopped 2 feet from her, looked at her trunk, looked at her face. "Miss Ashcroft?" he said. "Mr. Mercer," she said. He reached down and picked up her trunk. Didn't ask, didn't make a comment about its weight, which she'd been braced for. The trunk was heavy, she knew it was heavy, and men had been making comments about heavy things she carried for most of her adult life. He just picked it up and turned toward the house. "Come on in," he said. "You must be tired." She followed him across the yard, past the dark bulk of a barn and a smaller outbuilding she couldn't identify in the dark. The house was lit from inside, warm-looking in the way that frontier houses sometimes are when you're approaching them cold and exhausted. Like the light is almost aggressive in its welcome. He set her trunk on the porch. Then he opened the front door and stepped back so she could enter first. The inside was plain and spare, the way working houses are plain and spare. A central room with a table and chairs, a cast-iron stove, shelves on one wall with canned goods and tools, and a few books pushed together without apparent organization. A lamp on the table. The smell of something that had been cooked earlier in the evening, something with onion and salt. She stood in the center of the room and looked around. She was waiting for it. The comment, the look, the small adjustment in his face that would tell her he had expected something different and was now recalculating. It didn't come. He hung his hat on a peg by the door, crossed to the stove and checked something in a pot. "I kept supper warm," he said. "Figured you'd be hungry after the ride." "Thank you," she said. Her voice came out more carefully than she'd intended. "Sit down," he said. "I'll get you a plate." She sat. He brought her a plate of beans and salt pork and bread, and a cup of water, and then he sat across the table from her and didn't watch her eat, which was more consideration than she'd received from most people in her immediate family. When she'd eaten enough that the edge was off her hunger, she looked up. He was looking at the table, turning his cup slowly in his hands in the way of a man who has something to say and is deciding how to say it. "I should show you the room," he said finally. "Whenever you're ready," she said. He led her down a short hallway to a door on the right, opened it. The room inside was small but not cramped, with a window that would face east in the morning and a bed that was properly made. The sheets tight, the blanket folded back at the corner the way you'd do for a guest you'd thought about ahead of time. There was a small table beside the bed with a lamp on it, a hook on the wall for clothes. The room smelled clean, like it had been aired out that day. "I've got a spare room," he said. "It's yours." His voice was level. No performance in it, just information delivered, the way you'd tell someone the well was out back or the wood was stacked on the south side. "Here's the thing. It is yours." She stood in the doorway and looked at that made bed and that lit lamp in the east-facing window, and something moved in her chest that she couldn't name and didn't try to. She pressed it back down with the practice of years. "Thank you," she said. "I'll need to know your expectations for the morning." "Breakfast is usually just before sunup," he said, "but you've been traveling 2 weeks. Sleep as long as you need." Then he walked back down the hallway, and she heard him in the central room for a few minutes. The sound of a plate being washed, the stove being banked for the night. And then the creak of a door, and silence. She stood in the spare room for a long time after that, long enough for the lamp to burn lower and the room to settle into its nighttime sounds. Then she opened her trunk and took out her mother's recipe book and set it on the small table by the bed, and she sat down on the edge of the mattress, and she put both her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. She was here. She had arrived. The thing she had expected, the judgment, the revision, the moment of visible recalculation, had not happened. Not yet. She knew better than to call that safety. She had been surprised by kindness before, and she knew that kindness had a way of running out when the reality of a situation settled in. But she had arrived. The room was warm, the bed was made. The man in the other room had picked up her heavy trunk without saying a word about it. She lay down on top of the blanket, still in her coat, and stared at the ceiling, and tried to remember the last time someone had handed her a plate of food and not watched to see how much she ate. She couldn't remember. She was asleep in less than 10 minutes. Morning came cold and gray, and Mabel woke to the sound of boots in the yard before the sun was up. She lay still for a moment, reorienting. The ceiling here was lower than the boarding house ceiling, and the light came from the wrong direction, and it took her several seconds to remember where she was and why. Then she remembered. She got up, smoothed her dress, pinned her hair, and went to find the kitchen. Rowan Mercer was already outside when she came through the central room. She could see him through the window, moving between the barn and a smaller outbuilding, carrying something she couldn't identify. She found the kitchen by the logical method of following the smell of the banked coals, and she spent 20 minutes understanding the stove before she lit it, and another 20 minutes understanding where things were kept. The pantry was organized the way a man who mostly cooks for survival organizes a pantry, by container size rather than by ingredient type, which made finding things take longer than necessary. She noted this without judgment, just filed it away. She had eggs and bread and coffee ready when she heard him come to the back door and knock once before opening it, which surprised her, knocking at your own kitchen door. And then she understood, a beat later, that he was announcing himself, giving her the room in her own space. That was a small thing. She noticed it. He came in and stopped, looked at the table. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know I didn't," she said. "Sit down." He sat. She set a plate in front of him and poured the coffee and took the seat across from him, and they ate in a silence that was not comfortable yet. It was too new and too careful to be comfortable, but was not hostile either, which she counted as a reasonable beginning. After a while he said, "I'll show you around after, so you know the layout." "That would help," she said. "You ride?" "No." He absorbed this without visible reaction. "On foot is fine for now. There's enough close work to keep you occupied." "What does the close work involve?" she asked. "Kitchen management, mostly, storing for winter. I've got 4 hands who eat midday on property. They won't come inside, that's how I run it. There's a bench outside the barn, and then whatever's needed in the house." 4 men. What do they eat at midday?" He looked at her with a faint expression she couldn't quite read. "Whatever I've been putting out, which is usually bread and whatever's left over from the night before." She considered this. "What's your livestock situation for the winter? Feed supply?" He set his fork down, looked at her with more attention than he'd given her since she arrived. "Why?" "Because if I'm managing the kitchen, I need to understand the whole supply picture, not just the pantry. If you lose cattle over the winter from improper feed storage, that's a kitchen problem as much as a barn problem. It affects what I have to work with in the spring." A pause. Then, "That's not a yes or a no," she said. He almost smiled. She caught the edge of it before he put it back. "No," he said. "It's not. I'll walk you through the barn stores this afternoon." "Good," she said. They went back to eating. The silence this time had a slightly different quality. Less careful, maybe. Less like 2 people being polite and more like 2 people who had just agreed on something practical and were resting in the wake of it. She washed the plates after. He went back out without being told she could handle it. She had half expected him to hover, the way people sometimes did with a new person, watching to see if they'd do it right, which was really watching to see if they'd do it the way you'd do it yourself. He didn't hover. He left. She thought about that while she washed. It was such a small thing, leaving, and yet. She had been at Ash Hollow 3 weeks before she met Clay Barrett, and she would have preferred to go several more weeks without that particular introduction. But fate has never much concerned itself with anyone's preferences. She was at the general store in Heller's Creek when he came in. She knew who he was before anyone told her. You could tell from the way the room adjusted itself, the way people who'd been relaxed became slightly less relaxed, the way the store clerk's expression went from neutral to careful. Money and power in small towns produce that particular atmospheric shift, like pressure changing before a storm. He was a big man, Clay Barrett. Not fat, but thick through the chest and neck, the way men who've never done their own labor can sometimes be. Well-fed and well-clothed and accustomed to being the largest thing in any given room. He had a rancher's hat that was too clean, and boots that were too good for the mud he was tracking through the door. He stopped when he saw Mabel. She was at the dry goods shelf, checking the quality of a sack of dried beans she was considering. and she knew he was looking at her before he opened his mouth because she had spent 31 years developing a sensitivity to that particular quality of attention, the attention that precedes a comment. "Well," he said, to no one in particular, "so you're Mercer's bride." She did not turn around immediately. She pressed the bean sack once more, decided it was acceptable quality, and set it in her basket before she turned. "I'm Miss Ashcroft," she said. "You'd be Mr. Barrett, I imagine?" He seemed slightly startled that she'd identified him. Then he recovered and let his eyes move over her in that frank, assessing way that men who are accustomed to having power are sometimes careless enough to do in public. "Mercer said he was sending for a bride," he said. "Didn't say what kind." "What kind?" she repeated. "No offense meant," he said, in the tone of a man who means quite a bit of offense and knows that the phrase is legally sufficient to deny it. "None taken," she said, in the tone of a woman who has been having this exact exchange since she was 14 and has gotten very tired of her own graciousness about it. She took her basket to the counter. The clerk, a thin woman named Mrs. Holt, who wore her hair pinned back so severely it looked like it caused her some discomfort, totaled her items without looking up. "Must be hard," Clay Barrett said, leaning against the shelf behind her. "Working a frontier ranch at her Constitution." "I expect it's hard for most people," Mabel said. She paid for her goods. "Mercer's a decent enough man," he went on, and she understood that he was going to continue regardless of her responses, that she was not so much a conversational partner as an audience for something he'd already decided to say. "Decent, but not particular, maybe. That's what I've always thought about him. Not particular." She picked up her basket, turned to face him. "Mr. Barrett," she said, "I'm going to have to be rude to you now, and I want to warn you in advance so you're not caught off guard." He blinked. "What?" "I'm leaving, not because this conversation has been pleasant, because it hasn't, but because I have a full basket and 3 miles back to the ranch, and the afternoon isn't getting longer. I'm going to walk past you now. Past. You can say whatever you're going to say about my back once I've cleared the door. You'll say it anyway, so we might as well observe the proprieties." She walked past him. He didn't say anything while she was in earshot, and she didn't look back to check. Outside, loading her basket into the back of the wagon, she let herself have 3 full seconds of shaking hands before she gripped the side of the wagon and steadied herself. 3 seconds. That was all she allowed. Then she climbed up onto the seat and drove back to Ash Hollow. Tick. She didn't tell Rowan about the exchange. It didn't occur to her to tell him, which was itself a kind of information. She had spent so long processing that particular variety of cruelty alone that sharing it felt like an instruction she hadn't been given and wasn't sure she was allowed to follow. What she did instead was redirect the energy of it, which was something she was good at, which was the productive version of repression, probably. But it was what she had. She spent the following 2 days reorganizing the pantry. She pulled everything out, assessed it, disposed of the items that were past saving. There were several, which told her that previous management of the stores had been done by a man who checked inventory approximately never, and she reorganized what remained by use category, then by season of intended use. Winter staples on the bottom shelf, near-term cooking supplies at eye level. The system made immediate sense and would make more sense in February when provisions got tight and finding things quickly stopped being a convenience and started being a necessity. She created a written inventory. She went through the barn stores with Rowan on the 4th day and created a second inventory, cross-referenced with the kitchen one, and she identified 2 problems he hadn't noticed. The oat barrels on the east wall had developed moisture damage from a gap in the boards behind them, and 3 of the preserving jars in the cold cellar had failed their seals and would need to be replaced before winter set in. She told him both of these things at the supper table that evening, plainly, as information. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You want me to fix the boards? Unless you'd rather the oats rot." That edge of a smile again, there and gone. "I'll fix the boards," he said. "I'll reseal the jars tomorrow," she said. "The ones that can be salvaged." "What about the ones that can't?" "We'll need to replace them before the end of next month. I can go back to Heller's Creek for that." "I'll go with you," he said. She looked at him across the table. He was looking at his plate, not at her. The offer was delivered the same way everything he said was delivered, flatly, practically, like it was logistics and nothing more. That's not necessary, she said. No, he said. But Holt charges different prices depending on who he's talking to, and he charges lower prices to me than he'd charge to you. It's not right, but it's how it is. He glanced up. I'd rather you not pay the extra. She did not say what she was thinking, which was that no one had said I'd rather in her direction in a very long time without wanting something in return. All right, she said. We can go Thursday. Thursday, he agreed. They went back to the meal. The lamp on the table between them burned steadily. Outside, the wind was picking up from the north, bringing with it the early edge of what would be a cold season. She thought about the word particular, the way Clay Barrett had used it about Rowan. Not particular. As though a man who accepted a large woman from a mail-order advertisement had simply set his standards too low. As though the problem was Rowan's indifference rather than Barrett's cruelty. She thought about that for a while. And then she thought about the east-facing window in the spare room and the made bed and the way Rowan had knocked on the kitchen door from outside his own house. Not particular, Clay Barrett had said. She chewed this over along with her supper, and she decided that what Clay Barrett called not particular was something that she did not yet have a word for, but that she was going to pay close attention to. The ranch hands were named Chet, Dooley, Wade, and a man who everyone called Rabbit, because he had, apparently, once eaten a substantial quantity of raw carrots to win a bet, and the nickname had followed him across 2 territories. She met all 4 of them in the first week, not formally. There was no formal introduction. But in the natural way of a small working property where everyone's paths crossed daily. They were wary of her at first, not unkind, but guarded, in the way men on a ranch can be guarded around a new presence they don't know how to categorize. She understood this. She didn't push it. What she did instead was put an extra portion in the midday basket. Not commented on, not announced. Just more. On the 3rd day, Chet said something to her through the barn door about the bread being good, and she said thank you without stopping, and that was the entire exchange. And the following week, when the cold rain came through and she sent the midday basket with a pot of soup rather than the usual bread and yesterday's supper, she heard Wade say something from inside the barn that she couldn't make out but which landed, from its tone, in the general territory of approval. She didn't need their approval, but she noticed it the way you notice a door that has been closed for a long time finally coming open a crack. Not because you were waiting for it exactly, but because the change in air tells you something about the room beyond. Rabbit was the one who eventually said something directly. He was small and quick-eyed and had a habit of appearing in places without making noise, which Mabel found mildly startling until she got used to it. One morning near the end of her 2nd week, she was in the yard checking the state of the vegetable patch, which was productive enough but poorly laid out for the light it got. And Rabbit appeared at her elbow from approximately nowhere and said, "Mr. Barrett's men rode through yesterday." "What did they want?" she asked, without stopping her examination of the kale. "Don't know exactly. Talked to Mr. Mercer for a while. Mr. Mercer didn't look happy about it after." She stood up, looked at the bunkhouse where she could hear Rowan in the adjacent structure doing something with tools. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Rabbit shrugged, like the information had been too small to warrant thanks. "You're improving the place," he said. It wasn't a compliment exactly. It was more like a fact being acknowledged. "Figured you should know who's watching." She thought about that for the rest of the morning. That evening, while Rowan was banking the stove and she was going over her supply inventory at the table, she said, without looking up, "What did Barrett's men want?" A pause. "Who told you?" "Does it matter?" He was quiet for a moment. Then, "He's been making noises about the south pasture. Claims there's a survey discrepancy. That the fence line's in the wrong place." "Is there a discrepancy?" "No." "Do you have the survey documents?" Another pause, this one with a different quality, longer. "They're in the back of the filing drawer. I haven't looked at them in a few years." She set down her pen. "Then you should look at them." He turned away from the stove, looked at her. "Tonight?" he said. "Tonight would be reasonable," she said. "If Barrett's men are already asking questions, it means he's already thinking about something more significant than questions." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he crossed to the filing drawer and started looking. She went back to her inventory and let him work. Outside, the wind had finally settled, and the night was very still, and somewhere out past the fence line, the cattle moved in the dark with their low, unhurried sounds. She thought about what Rabbit had said. "You're improving the place. Figured you should know who's watching." She thought about the south pasture. She thought about Clay Barrett, who was too clean for a rancher and too loud for a man who didn't need to be heard. She pressed her pen to the page and kept writing. There was a great deal of winter left to prepare for, and she had learned, in the past 31 years, that the only response to a world that watched you and waited for you to fail was to make yourself, quietly and without announcement, indispensable. That was what she intended to do. That was exactly what she intended to do. The survey documents were in worse shape than Rowan had let on. Mabel could tell by the way he held them, carefully, the way you hold something you're afraid might fall apart if you grip it too hard, and by the silence that settled over him when he spread them on the table and looked at what he had. She moved the lamp closer without being asked and looked with him. The main survey map was dated 11 years back, drawn in the precise small hand of a territorial surveyor, and it was clear enough in the center portions, but the eastern and southern edges had been exposed to moisture at some point. Not catastrophically, but enough that the ink had bled in 2 places along the boundary lines, making the exact demarcation of the south pasture fence line genuinely difficult to read. "That's where he's making his claim," Rowan said, tapping the blurred section with one finger. "Of course it is," Mabel said. She sat down across from him and pulled the map toward her and looked at it for a long time. Then she said, "Is there a secondary document? A field notes record? Surveyors usually keep a written record in addition to the map." "I don't know. Look in the back of that drawer." He looked. There was no field notes record. What there was, pushed to the very back corner behind a collection of receipts and a folded cattle registration certificate, was a letter from the original Territorial Land Office confirming the survey had been filed and recorded. The letter referenced a filing number. "That's something," Mabel said. She copied the filing number onto the bottom of her supply inventory page. "The Territorial Land Office will have a copy of the original survey on record. If the ink on this one is compromised, the official record stands regardless." Rowan looked at the filing number, then at her. "How do you know that?" "My father worked for a county clerk's office when I was young," she said. "Before he left. I used to sit in the back and watch the filing. You remember the things you spend enough time watching." He absorbed this without comment. She appreciated that about him, the way he took information and simply incorporated it rather than making the information about her, the way most people would have, asking follow-up questions about her father or her childhood or the leaving part of that sentence. "So we need to get to the territorial office," he said. "Someone does," she said. "The town clerk here might have a copy too. It's worth checking before you make the longer trip." "I'll go tomorrow." "Take the letter," she said, "with the filing number. It'll make the search faster." She slid the letter across the table. He picked it up. They both sat for a moment, looking at the blurred survey map on the table between them. "Barrett's been trying to get this parcel for 3 years," Rowan said. It was the first time he'd offered that information, and she had the impression it was information he'd been deciding whether to share for a while. "The south pasture runs along the creek. It's the only reliable water source on this side of the valley in a dry summer. And Barrett's operation is east of the creek? East and uphill. If he controls the south pasture, he controls the water access." She looked at the map again, at the blurred ink, at the way the creek ran, a thin, wavering line through the center of the disputed territory. "How many of your cattle depend on that water in summer?" "All of them," he said. The lamp burned between them. From outside came the sound of the wind picking up again, and somewhere in the barn a horse shifted its weight with a sound like a slow, deliberate statement. "You should also document the fence line," she said. "Photograph it if you can get access to a camera, or have witnesses walk it and sign a record. If he's planning to challenge the survey, he's planning to challenge the physical boundary next. You want witnesses to its current position." Rowan looked at her across the table for a long moment, not in the examining way Clay Barrett had looked at her. This was something different, something that felt less like assessment and more like reconsideration, maybe. Like he was revising an estimate upward. "You've been thinking about this already," he said. Before tonight. Since Rabbit told me, she admitted. That was this morning. I know. He picked up the letter, folded it carefully, and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he said, Thank you, Mabel. It was the first time he'd used her name. She had noticed in the weeks since she arrived that he'd avoided it, not from forgetting, she was sure of that, but from some private form of consideration she hadn't fully understood. As though using someone's name too early was a kind of presumption. She didn't say you're welcome because that would have made a moment out of it, and she didn't want to make a moment out of it. Get some sleep, she said instead. The clerk's office opens at 8. He pushed back from the table, stood. Then, at the doorway to the hall, he paused. The south pasture, he said. The grass runs good there in autumn, when the rest of the property's going thin. I know, she said. I saw it. He nodded. And then he went down the hall to his room, and she sat alone at the table with the lamp and the blurred survey map, and she pressed her hand flat on the page over the damaged boundary lines, as if she could somehow hold them in place by will alone. She could not, of course, but she kept her hand there for a long time anyway. The town clerk did not have a copy of the original survey. What he had was a general property register that confirmed the acreage and general boundary description of Ash Hollow Ranch, which helped somewhat, but not specifically enough for what Rowan needed. He told Mabel this when he came home that afternoon, and she received the news with the expression of someone who had already considered this outcome and moved on to the next option. The territorial office is in Calford, she said. That's 3 days by wagon. I know how far it is, he said. Can you go? Not until after the south herds move to winter pasture. That's 2 weeks out. Then we have 2 weeks to make sure the fence line is witnessed, she said. Who's the most reliable man in town? Someone Barrett can't buy and that people would believe in front of a magistrate. He thought about this for a moment. Probably Elias Dodd. He runs the livery. He's been here since the territory was mapped. Can you ask him to walk the fence line with you? I can ask him, Rowan said. He won't refuse for nothing, but he won't need much. Offer him a fair price, she said. Whatever's fair, don't underpay him and don't overpay him. Overpaying makes the testimony look purchased. Rowan looked at her again with that expression she was starting to recognize, the recalibration look. She was getting used to it without quite knowing what to do with it. Where did you learn to think like this? He asked. Surviving, she said simply, and went back to the kitchen. She heard him stand there for a moment in the doorway. Then he put on his hat and went back out to the yard. But the first snow of the season came on a Thursday, light and mostly decorative, the kind of snow that coats everything in white by morning and then melts before noon and makes you feel briefly like winter is manageable. Mabel watched it through the kitchen window while she worked and thought about the preserving jars, which she'd been resealing methodically over the past week, and about the oat barrels, which Rowan had reboarded on the east wall and which she'd inspected twice since to confirm the moisture problem was solved. Chet knocked on the back door that morning, which he had never done before, and when she opened it, he was holding his hat in both hands and looking somewhere between uncomfortable and determined. Ma'am, he said, Rabbit's knee is bad again. He can't do the morning rounds. All right, she said, we were wondering if you had any of that willow bark from the thing you made for Dooley's hands last week. Dooley's hands had cracked badly from the cold, badly enough that gripping a rope caused real pain. She had made a preparation from dried willow bark she'd found in the storage room, left from some previous occupant of the ranch who apparently knew herbalism, or had known someone who did, and soaked his wrappings in it. It had helped enough that Dooley had told the others, apparently, and now Chet was at her door, hat in hand, asking for the same. Tell Rabbit to come here this evening, she said. I'll look at the knee. It's probably inflammation. There's nothing to do about it in the short term except rest and warmth, but I want to see how bad it is before I say that for certain. Chet nodded. Then he said, still holding his hat, You're not what I expected. She looked at him. What did you expect? He shifted his weight. I don't know exactly. Someone... He stopped, started again. We'd heard you were... that Mercer had sent for... that he'd sent for a fat woman nobody else wanted, she said. Not unkindly, just plainly. Chet went red in a way that was almost painful to watch. I didn't mean... I know what you mean, she said. I appreciate you telling me what you were thinking rather than just thinking it. That's more than most people manage. She handed him a portion of the willow bark preparation she'd mixed. For Rabbit's knee tonight. Have him come by in the evening regardless. He took it. He looked like a man who had started a sentence expecting to end up somewhere else entirely. Thank you, he said. Get back to work, she said. The snow won't last, but it'll be slippery while it does. He left. She closed the door and stood with her back against it for a moment. You're not what I expected. She had been hearing some version of that sentence her entire adult life, and it had always held two layers, the genuine surprise and beneath it, the implicit reminder of what had been expected, which was always less. Less competence, less sense, less value. As though her size was supposed to be a reliable predictor of her worth, and her worth persisting despite her size was the surprise. She understood they didn't mean it that way. Most of them didn't, anyway. But understanding it didn't make the layers disappear. She went back to the kitchen and started on the midday meal. Rabbit's knee was inflamed but not seriously damaged. He had an old injury there, he told her when he came to the house that evening, from a horse accident 3 years back that had never fully healed. She wrapped it with a preparation she'd made from what she had available and told him to stay off it for 2 days, which he argued about, and she told him to stay off it or turn the inflammation into something that would keep him off it for 2 weeks, at which point he stopped arguing. Barrett's men came by again today, he said while she was wrapping. He said it to the floor, not to her, the way he had a habit of delivering information, sideways like it was incidental. How many? She asked. 3. Talked to Chet at the fence line for a while. Chet told them to go on, and they did, but slow. What were they looking at? Rabbit glanced up. The south pasture fence, spent time looking at the posts. She finished the wrap and tied it off. Tell Rowan tonight when he comes in, she said. Not tomorrow, tonight. Yes, ma'am. She sat back in the chair across from him. Rabbit. Ma'am? How long have you worked for Mr. Mercer? 6 years, he said, since before his wife passed. She held his gaze for a moment. Is he a good man? He considered this with the seriousness of someone who knew the question wasn't casual. He doesn't take more than his share, he said finally, and he doesn't give you less than yours. In my experience, that's rarer than it should be. She nodded slowly. Thank you, she said, for telling me. Both things. When Rowan came in that evening and she told him about Barrett's men examining the fence posts, his expression changed in a way she'd not seen before. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more resolved than anger, something that sat behind his eyes and made them still. He's measuring, Rowan said. To dispute the position, she said. Yes. If he claims the fence was placed incorrectly and the real boundary is 10 feet east, he takes the creek access, she said. I know. He pulled out a chair and sat heavily. He was tired. He was always tired by evening, the visible tiredness of a man who worked a physical operation with not quite enough hands. But this was a different kind of tired, the kind that comes from a problem that doesn't have a quick fix. She set a plate in front of him and then sat across from him instead of retreating to the other side of the kitchen the way she'd been doing for the first 2 weeks. They had moved, without explicitly negotiating it, toward the habit of eating together, and she had started to count on the hour it gave her to think through the next day's work while someone else was in the room, and she didn't have to be alone with the walls of her own head. When is Dodd coming to walk the fence line? She asked. Saturday, he said. Can you move it to tomorrow? He looked up from his plate. If Barrett's men were measuring today, she said, we don't have until Saturday. He chewed, swallowed. I'll go to town tonight, he said. It's late. Dodd won't mind. He pushed back from the table, looked at the plate, looked at her. I'll eat when I get back. I'll keep it warm, she said. He took his hat and coat and went out. She heard the horse in the yard a few minutes later, and then the sound of hooves diminishing in the direction of town, and then silence. She moved his plate to the back of the stove where it would stay warm without drying out. Then she sat at the table with her inventory sheets and her lamp and worked through the cold storage numbers again, because the numbers were the things she could control, and right now the things she couldn't control were piling up, and she needed the ballast. He came back 2 hours later. Dodd would be there at dawn. She put his plate on the table. He sat and ate without speaking for several minutes, and she sat across from him and didn't speak either, and the lamp burned between them in the same steady way it always did, which she had started to find. She noticed this with something approaching alarm, genuinely comforting. "He's going to keep pushing," Rowan said, without looking up from his plate. "Even after we get the documents from Calford, Barrett doesn't stop when he's wrong. He just changes what he's pushing for." "I know," she said. "I want you to know that before—" He stopped. "I mean to say, this property might not be as uncomplicated as you expected when you answered the advertisement." She looked at him for a moment. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I answered that advertisement because I was a woman with nowhere left to go and nothing much left to lose. I did not come here expecting simple." He met her eyes. There was something in his face she couldn't read completely. It had too many layers to it, too many things he was used to keeping back, but the visible surface of it was something plain and honest and slightly tired. "No," he said. "I don't suppose you did." They sat in the lamplight, and the ranch settled around them into the night, and neither of them said anything else, and it was the most honest conversation she'd had in years. Elias Dodd was a compact, weathered man of about 60 who walked the fence line with the methodical attention of someone who had testified in land disputes before and understood that precision was the thing that mattered. He paced distances, marked posts, and wrote everything down in a small notebook in a handwriting that was surprisingly clear for a man with hands that looked like they'd been through considerable abuse. He walked the entire south pasture boundary with Rowan, and Mabel walked with them, because no one had told her not to, and she intended to know what was being recorded. At the third fence post from the creek, Dodd stopped, crouched, looked at the base of the post where it met the ground. "Someone's been digging here," he said. Rowan crouched beside him. Mabel looked from where she stood. The ground around the base of the post was disturbed. Not dramatically, not obviously, but once Dodd pointed it out, she could see it. The soil packed differently. The grass was broken in a pattern that suggested tools. "They moved it," Rowan said. His voice was very flat. "Or tried to," Dodd said. "Didn't get it all the way. See here. The original base is still visible, the old hole." He pointed with his pen. "Post was moved at most 3-4 inches east of where it originally sat. 4 inches. On a property this size, against a creek boundary, 4 inches was enough." "When?" Rowan said. "Recent. Last 2-3 days." Rowan stood up. His jaw was tight. Mabel watched him work through whatever he was working through, the way a man does when he's deciding between the anger that feels satisfying and the action that's actually useful. He chose the action. "Write it down," he said to Dodd. "All of it. The original hole, the current position, the condition of the ground." "Already am," Dodd said. Mabel looked at the post, then at the creek, 10 yards distant, its surface catching the morning light in the thin, cold way of water in late autumn, then back at the post. "Can you reset it?" she asked Dodd. "Return it to the original position and note in your record that you did so, and the evidence on which you base that determination?" Dodd looked at her, then at Rowan. "She's asking you," Rowan said. "I can," Dodd said. "It's straightforward enough. The original position is still visible, and it should be reset. Leaving it moved would compound the problem." "Then please do that," Mabel said, "and note in your record that it was reset, when, by whom, and on what basis." Dodd looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a man who has been in a profession a long time and has just encountered someone who understands it without having been in it. "You've done this before," he said. "No," she said, "but I've watched people do it wrong enough times to know what right looks like." He almost smiled, wrote in his notebook. Rowan was looking at the disturbed ground around the fence post with an expression that had gone past anger into something quieter and more dangerous. She stepped to his side. "He's given us something," she said quietly enough that only he would hear. "Tampering with a boundary marker is not a civil dispute. It's criminal. You have a witness and written documentation now." "I know." he said. His voice was rough. Don't do anything with it yet, she said. Document everything. Get the Calford records. Then you have something he can't argue around. He looked at her. And in the meantime? In the meantime, she said, we keep doing what we're doing. We run this ranch. We make it profitable. We store enough to survive winter and then some. We give him nothing to exploit and everything to envy. She held his gaze. That's how you beat a man like Barrett, not in a single moment, in the accumulation. He was quiet for a long moment. All right, he said. Dodd reset the post, documented everything, left that afternoon with his notebook and a fair payment from Rowan and the reassurance that he would be available to testify if the matter reached a magistrate, which they all understood it probably would. Now, the weeks that followed had the particular quality of a kettle that's been put on the fire and is not yet boiling but is making preliminary noises. The pressure built quietly. Barrett's men were visible at the property edges more often now, and twice Mabel saw riders on the ridge above the south pasture who were obviously watching rather than passing through. She didn't let it change her routine. That was the discipline. Not pretending the threat wasn't there, but refusing to let it become the center of gravity that everything else orbited. She finished the winter stores. They were, she estimated, substantially better than the previous years had been. 20% more preserved vegetables, a proper system for rotating the cold cellar inventory, and the feed barrels fixed and packed against the east wall with significantly better moisture protection. The ranch hands had stopped being wary of her somewhere around week 5. Chet brought her firewood without being asked. Wade had started leaving produce from his own small vegetable plot at the back door when he had surplus, without comment, like it was something he'd always done. She had learned all 4 of their names properly. Rabbit's real name was Henry, which he hated, which was why no one used it. And she had learned their food preferences and their medical complaints, and which ones needed quiet in the morning and which ones would talk all through the midday meal if you let them. She liked them, she realized one day, with some surprise. She liked them as people, which was different from tolerating them as a professional situation. And she wasn't entirely used to liking people because she wasn't used to being in a situation long enough for it to develop. One evening in the 5th week, returning from the cold cellar with her arms full of the newly sealed jars she'd been checking, she came through the back door to find Rowan at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and a pen, writing something. He looked up when she came in. Profits are up, he said. She set the jars down. How much? 15% over the same period last year. He looked at the paper. It's the feed wastage. What you did with the barn stores, Chet says we've lost almost nothing this season compared to last year. And the meal planning. The hands work better when they're eating properly. He paused. Which I should have figured out myself. You run a cattle operation, she said. You can't think of everything. Barrett's going to notice, he said. When the numbers are visible. Barrett was already watching, she said. A more profitable ranch just makes the south pasture more valuable to him, not less. I know. He set down the pen. I'm not saying it's bad. I'm saying we need to be ready. She looked at him across the kitchen. He'd aged, she thought, since she'd arrived, not in the physical way of someone getting older, but in the particular way of someone who'd been carrying something heavy for too long and hadn't put it down. She'd seen that look before, in the mirror, and she knew what it meant. The Calford trip, she said. After the herd moves? Next week, if the weather holds. I'll manage things here, she said. He looked up from the paper. I was thinking... He stopped, started again. I was going to ask if you wanted to come. The territorial office might have records that need someone to read them properly, and you... He stopped again. You rid things properly. She stood there by the kitchen counter with her arms at her sides and looked at the man across the table from her, and she thought about what it meant that he had used the word properly in that way. Not as a compliment, not as a performance of appreciation, but as a plain assessment of a capacity she had and he needed. Just true. Just factual. Yes, she said. I'll come. He nodded. Went back to his paper. She turned to put the jars away, and she was almost to the shelf when she heard him say quietly, more to the table than to her, I'm glad you answered the advertisement. She stood with her back to him and her hands on the jar she was shelving, and she thought, so am I. She didn't say it. It was too large a thing to say in a kitchen on an ordinary Thursday, with the lamp burning low and the wind outside picking up from the north. But she thought it. And that was something she had not expected to think, and it was the most frightening thing she had felt since she'd arrived. The road to Calford was 3 days of cold and bad terrain, and a wagon that had one wheel slightly out of true, which produced a rhythmic complaint every 8 or 10 rotations that Mabel counted for the first half hour before she made herself stop counting. Rowan drove, and she sat beside him on the bench, which was different from sitting across a table from him in a lamplit kitchen, because there was no table between them and nowhere particular to look except the road ahead, and the road ahead was not interesting enough to absorb the full attention of 2 people for 3 days. So they talked. Not continuously. Not in the way of people who are performing conversation. In the way of 2 people who have established enough comfort with silence that words can be offered without obligation. You could say something and the other person could respond or not respond, and neither outcome was a failure. He told her about the ranch, not the business of it, which she already knew, but the history. How his father had filed the original claim 23 years ago on land that everyone said was too exposed and too far from the main supply route to be worth developing, and how his father had been wrong about most things but right about this particular parcel, which turned out to have the best natural water access in the valley once the creek was properly understood. He was a difficult man, Rowan said, without particular emotion, about his father. Hard to please. But he knew land. Did he know cattle? Less so. That was more my mother's area, actually. She'd grown up on a ranch east of here. She could read a cow's health better than most veterinarians. Is she still living? No, he said. She went the winter before I filed for the property expansion, the South Pasture expansion, the one Barrett's contesting. She's the one who told me to go for it, said the creek access was worth 5 times the filing fee. Mabel held that for a moment. The South Pasture had belonged, in some sense, to his mother's judgment as much as to any survey document. She was right, Mabel said. She usually was, he said, which made her difficult to argue with. Most people who are usually right have that quality. He glanced at her. I've noticed, he said, and then looked back at the road. And she understood that this was as close as he was going to come, today at least, to saying something direct about her specifically, and she found that she was all right with that. They made camp the first night near a stand of cottonwood trees along a dry creek bed, and Rowan built a fire with the efficiency of someone who'd done it 1,000 times and didn't need to think about it, and Mabel unpacked the food she'd prepared for the journey, bread and dried meat and 2 portions of the bean preparation she'd sealed into jars, and which were still warm from being wrapped in a blanket since morning. He looked at the warm food with an expression she'd started to catalog, the expression that appeared when she did something he hadn't anticipated and wasn't sure how to respond to. He did that more than he probably knew. You planned for warm food, he said. It's a 3-day trip in late autumn, she said. A cold camp doesn't require cold eating. He sat down on the opposite side of the fire. My wife used to do that, he said. Plan ahead for the small things. It was the first time he had mentioned his wife directly. He said it in the same flat, informational tone he used for most things, but there was something beneath it that she recognized as the particular flatness people develop around subjects that still have live edges. She sounds like a practical woman, Mabel said. She was, he said, practical and funny. She had a way of making you feel stupid for worrying about things and then solving them before you'd stopped worrying. He poked the fire with a stick. She died 2 years ago. Fever. It moved fast. I'm sorry, Mabel said. Thank you, he said. It was short and real and didn't ask for anything more. They ate. The fire burned down to a good steady heat. Above them, the stars were doing their excessive frontier thing, and somewhere in the cottonwoods a nightbird said something once and then stopped. She thought about what it took to answer a mail-order advertisement when you were a man who had been married to someone practical and funny and quick. What kind of loneliness drove you to that particular action? Or maybe it wasn't loneliness exactly. Maybe it was just practicality in return, the understanding that a working ranch needed 2 working people, and that the conventional routes to finding that person had closed off somehow. She didn't ask. It wasn't the time for it, and she was not sure it was any of her business, regardless of the fact that she was, technically, the response to that advertisement. Get some sleep, she said instead. You'll want to make time tomorrow before the weather shifts. He looked at the sky, assessing it with the specific competence of a man who read weather by habit. Another day before it turns, he said. But yes. She wrapped herself in the blanket she'd brought and lay on her side facing the dying fire. And the cold was not pleasant, but was manageable, and she listened to the cottonwood leaves making their dry, rattling sound until she fell asleep. She dreamed about Thomas. She hadn't in months, and she resented it. The way dreams don't ask permission, don't care that you've processed something and moved on and rebuilt the wall to a reasonable height. In the dream, he was handing her something, a folded piece of paper, and she was trying not to take it, and he kept holding it out and saying, "You know what it says?" And she did know what it said, and she still didn't want to take it. She woke up before dawn with her jaw clenched. She lay there for a moment, breathing. The fire was embers. Rowan was asleep on the other side of it, his hat over his face, which she found unexpectedly human and a little funny. She eased that thought in quietly until the dream let go. Then she got up and rebuilt the fire for breakfast. But Calford was a real town, which Heller's Creek was not quite. It had a main street with brick buildings on both sides and a territorial courthouse with actual columns, and a land records office that shared a building with the Surveyor General's operation and smelled like paper and old ink and the particular dusty authority of filed documents. The records clerk was a young man with a precise part in his hair and an expression of controlled suspicion that was probably professional habit around anyone coming in to look at land records. He relaxed somewhat when he understood what they were looking for and why, and more so when Mabel produced the filing number and the letter from the original survey and the copy of the damaged map, all organized in a paper folder she'd assembled before the trip. "Filed 11 years back," the clerk said, checking the number. "Give me 20 minutes." He came back in 12. The original survey filing was intact and complete, and the boundary lines on the official copy were crisp and unambiguous, and the South Pasture fence line was documented exactly where Elias Dodd had confirmed it to be, and exactly where Barrett's men had tried to move it away from. She made Rowan ask for 2 certified copies. She had brought money for the fee herself, in case he hadn't, and he had, but she was glad she'd thought to bring it. They stood on the steps of the Land Records office afterward with the certified copies in a protected envelope and the cold Calford air coming off the mountains to the west, and Rowan looked at the envelope in his hands and then at her. "It's done," he said. "It's documented," she said. "Done depends on what Barrett does next." "Right. But we have what we need," she said. "Dodd's record, the certified copies, the evidence of tampering. If he takes it to a magistrate, you have a case. If he doesn't take it to a magistrate, he knows you have a case. Either way, the South Pasture is documented as yours." He nodded. He was holding the envelope with the particular care of someone holding a thing that has cost a lot to obtain. "Thank you," he said, "for thinking of the filing number." "Thank your father's filing habits," she said. "He kept the letter." "He kept everything," Rowan said. "He was the opposite of organized about most things, but he never threw away a document. Drove my mother insane." "Your mother sounds like she and I would have gotten along," Mabel said. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. Briefly, just briefly. And then he looked away toward the street. "Yes," he said. "I think she would have liked you." They went to find the wagon and start the return trip. The journey back was 2.5 days because the weather, Rowan had predicted, held off a day longer than expected. And on the evening of the second day, the sky opened and they drove through cold driving rain for 3 hours that made the road miserable and conversation functionally impossible over the noise of it. She sat beside him on the bench with her coat collar turned up and her hat brim angled against the rain and did not complain, because complaining about weather was the most useless expenditure of energy she could think of, and also because he was the one driving, which was a harder position to be in. When they stopped for the night, she was wet through and cold in the specific bone-deep way of someone who has been cold for too long without the prospect of heat. He built the fire faster in the rain. She watched him do it, watched the methodical competence of it, and thought that there was a difference between watching someone do something practical with that kind of efficiency and watching someone perform competence for an audience. He was not performing for an audience. He was just making a fire in the rain because it needed to be made. She got water boiling as soon as the fire was stable and made the simplest hot preparation she could manage with what remained of their supplies, and they ate hunched over the fire with the rain coming down around them in the dark. And it was objectively miserable, and she was aware of being in the middle of it without actually minding very much. "You're not complaining," he said at one point. "Would it help?" "No?" "Then there's your answer." He looked at her through the rain and firelight. "Most people would be complaining," he said. "I'm not most people," she said, "which you knew when you read my letter." He was quiet for a moment, then, "What made you answer it?" She had known this question was coming, or some version of it. She'd been deciding for 2 days what the honest answer was. "I had nothing left to lose," she said, which is a terrible reason, I know, but it was also a freeing one. When you've already lost most of what mattered to you, the things that used to seem frightening become smaller. What's the worst outcome? Another rejection. I've survived those. "The letter you wrote," he said, "where you described yourself. You didn't have to do that." "I always do that," she said. "I learned a long time ago that letting people be surprised by what I look like costs more than telling them ahead of time. At least this way, the cruelty, if it comes, has the decency to arrive before I've already moved across the country." He poked the fire. Sparks went up in the rain and died immediately. "I wasn't going to be cruel about it," he said. "I didn't know that," she said. "You were a stranger." "Fair," he said. "You still haven't told me," she said carefully. "What made you place the advertisement?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. The rain came down. The fire persisted against it. "Clara, my wife. She told me before she died," he said, "that the worst thing I could do was let the ranch become a tomb. Her word. A tomb. She said I'd do it. She knew me well enough to know I'd do it. Work myself into the ground and call it living and never let anyone close enough to notice." He paused. "She was usually right about things." "So you placed the advertisement for her," Mabel said. "I placed it for me," he said. "But her voice was in my head when I did it." They sat with that for a while. The fire crackled and hissed with the rain. "Did it work?" she asked. "Is it less like a tomb?" He looked at her across the fire, and whatever was in his face was complicated enough that she couldn't fully read it in the rain and the firelight. "Yes," he said, "it's less like a tomb." She looked back at the fire. The rain was easing slightly, shifting from driving to steady. "Good," she said, and meant it. They arrived back at Ash Hollow on the afternoon of the third day, rain-tired and road-stiff, to find Rabbit and Chet in the yard with expressions that told her immediately something had happened. "Barrett was here," Chet said. Rowan climbed down from the wagon. "When?" "Yesterday afternoon. Came himself this time, not his men. Brought 2 other men with him, the one who works as his foreman, and someone else I didn't recognize." Chet's jaw was tight. "He asked to see the property record. We told him you weren't here." "What did he say?" "That he'd be back, that there was a matter of a boundary correction that needed to be sorted before winter." Chet paused. "He also said—" He stopped. "What?" Rowan said. Chet looked at Mabel and then back at Rowan. "He said that the sensible thing would be for you to sell the south pasture outright, at a fair price. He said that it would be simpler than a magistrate proceeding, and that a magistrate proceeding would be costly and disruptive and would draw attention to, his word was irregularities, in the original filing." "There are no irregularities in the original filing," Mabel said. "No," Chet agreed, "but he said there were." Rowan was very still. She recognized the stillness. She'd been watching it for 2 months now, the particular quality of quiet that preceded a decision rather than an eruption. He was running through it, mapping the moves. "He knows we went to Calford," Rowan said. It was not a question. "Probably," Rabbit said, from his position leaning against the barn wall. "He's got eyes on the road." "Then he knows we have the certified copies," Mabel said. "Or he suspects it," Rabbit said. "Which is why he came while we were away," she said, "trying to settle it before we got back, before we had documentation in hand." Rowan looked at her. "What do we do?" "Nothing today," she said. Today you put the horse away and I make supper and we sleep in our own beds. Tomorrow you write a letter to the territorial magistrate's office documenting the fence tampering, the attempted pressure to sell, and attaching certified copies of the survey. You send it before Barrett can file anything first. She looked at Chet. Did he leave anything in writing? No, Chet said. Of course not, she said. Men like Barrett don't commit things to paper until they have to. She picked up her bag from the wagon. He's bluffing about the irregularities. He's hoping the word sounds frightening enough that Rowan will want to avoid the proceeding. He doesn't have anything. You sound sure of that, Chet said. I'm sure enough, she said. If he had a genuine case, he'd have filed it already rather than riding out here personally to suggest a quiet settlement. Quiet settlements are the tactic of people who don't want scrutiny. Chet and Rabbit exchanged a look that she didn't try to interpret. Rowan came around the wagon and took his bag. He stood beside her for a moment before going in. You worked that out fast, he said. I worked it out on the road back, she said. I had 3 days to think. The whole time? Most of it. He shook his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in the specific way of someone updating an estimate they thought was already high. All right, he said. Letter tomorrow. First thing, she said. Before breakfast. He went inside. She followed. Barrett did not come back the following week or the week after. The letter went to the magistrate's office. Elias Dodd was formally notified that his testimony might be required. The certified survey copies were stored in a second location she did not tell Rowan about. She locked them inside the tin trunk she'd arrived with under her bed in the spare room, because if anyone came looking for documents, the obvious first place would be the filing drawer in the main room. She told him about the second location one evening, and he looked at the spare room door for a moment. The trunk, he said. Yes. Smart, he said. And that was that. The ranch went into its winter rhythm. The days shortened. The cold came in earnest, the real cold, not the decorative November cold, but the December cold that had weight and intention. She had planned for it, and they were ready for it. And this fact produced a specific quiet satisfaction she was not accustomed to feeling about a situation she was in rather than observing from outside. The ranch hands had fully stopped being guarded around her. Chet had taken to stopping in the kitchen doorway in the mornings with a question or a piece of information that was usually, she suspected, more pretext than necessity. He was just stopping in, the way you stop into a room where someone lives who has become familiar. She didn't discourage it. She had spent years living in spaces where she felt like a provisional resident, and she had not expected, arriving at Ash Hollow by wagon in the dark, to feel any differently here. Yet somewhere in the cold weeks between autumn and winter, without marking the exact moment, she had stopped feeling provisional. This was frightening in a specific way she kept examining, the way you keep touching a bruise to see if it still hurts. She found the letter on a Thursday afternoon in December. She had been cleaning the small room beside the kitchen, a utility room, really, that held spare tools and a broken chair waiting to be repaired, and a number of items she'd been slowly cataloging and organizing, and behind a loose board at the back of the lower shelf, she found a small box, cedar, with a sliding lid. She opened it, because that was her nature. She cataloged things. She identified things. She needed to know what was in containers. Inside the box was a letter, folded 3 times. Written in a woman's hand, the ink slightly faded. She should have put it back. She knew, the moment she unfolded it, that she should put it back. But she had already read the first 2 lines, and something in them stopped her hand. Rowan, if you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've been exactly as stubborn and shut off as I knew you'd be. You haven't let anyone in. You've been working yourself like the work is punishment, like if you just work hard enough, long enough, you'll eventually get to a place where it hurts less. You won't, love. That's not how it works. She stood in the utility room with the letter in her hands and her heart doing something irregular and uncomfortable, and she did not put it down. I want you to let someone in. I know you hate me saying it because you'll do what you want regardless of what I want. But I'm saying it because you deserve it, and because the ranch deserves it, and because I know, I have always known, that you have more to give than you've ever let anyone see. Don't let it rot, Rowan. Don't let the good of you rot in that house alone. She stopped reading there. She folded the letter carefully, exactly as it had been folded, the same creases, and placed it back in the cedar box and placed the cedar box back behind the board and pressed the board flat against the shelf. She stood in the utility room for a long time with her hands at her sides. The letter was not what she'd feared. She understood that, intellectually. It was a woman writing to her husband from the edge of her own death, asking him to live. It was love, and it was grief, and it was the most human thing she'd read in years. But here was what she could not stop her mind from doing. She read it as a document of what Rowan was carrying, what he had been carrying since his wife died, and she set it against the kindness he'd shown her. The made bed, the carried trunk, the knocked door. And she thought, he is being kind to you because a dying woman asked him to be kind to someone. And she thought, you have mistaken instruction for feeling. You have done this before. Thomas had said kind things too. Thomas had held her hand and brought her wilted flowers, and she had believed those things were evidence of how he saw her, and they were not evidence of anything except that Thomas had wanted, for a while, to be the kind of man who did those things. She was doing it again. She was reading kindness as more than kindness. She was building a structure on a foundation she had not checked. She pressed the board flat against the shelf one more time. Then she went to the kitchen and began preparing supper. She was quiet at the table that evening, Rowan noticed. She could tell he noticed because he looked at her twice and then did not look at her again with the deliberate quality of someone making a decision not to pry. She was glad he didn't ask. She had nothing she could have said that wouldn't have sounded either invasive or small. She lay awake that night for a long time. The spare room was warm. The east window let in the cold blue light of a clear winter sky. She had lived in this room for 3 months now, long enough that it smelled like her. Like the lavender she kept in a small pouch on the bedside table. Like the cedar of her trunk. Like the wool of the blanket she'd added when the temperature dropped. It was a spare room. That was what he had called it. I've got a spare room. It's yours, practical and clear. Not a promise and not an invitation, just the provision of a fact. Here's a space, you may occupy it. She turned onto her side and looked at the wall. Her trunk was against the wall and the recipe book on the bedside table and the dried lavender pouch and the lamp. And she had made this spare room into the most inhabited space she'd lived in since she left her mother's house, which should have told her something. The thing she was most afraid of, she realized, lying there in the dark, was not Barrett and the South Pasture and the magistrate proceedings and all the external machinery of threat. The thing she was most afraid of was this, that she was going to let herself believe she belonged here, genuinely belonged here, and that she was going to be wrong about it the same way she had been wrong before, and that this time she had nothing left to break that hadn't already been broken. She pressed her hands flat on the mattress on either side of her, the way she'd pressed them the first night, feeling the solid reality of the frame beneath the ticking. It's just a spare room, she told herself. You know better than this. She almost believed it. Outside, the winter dark settled over Ash Hollow Ranch, and the cold came down from the mountains in long, slow waves, and in the barn the cattle shifted and settled with their warm animal sounds. And the house held its heat the way it had been built to do, and Mabel Ashcroft lay in the warmest room in the house, and told herself she knew better than to feel what she was feeling. She told herself that until sleep finally came. She was not, in the end, as convinced as she needed to be. Barrett's formal offer arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a rider she didn't recognize, sealed in an envelope addressed to Rowan Mercer, and left on the porch rail without knocking. She found it before Rowan came in for breakfast, and she left it at his place at the table. He opened it while she set the coffee down, and she watched his face read the contents with the trained blankness of someone who had decided not to give anything away before he understood what he was giving it away to. He read it twice. Then he set it down. He's offering to buy the South Pasture, he said, at a number that's about 40% of what it's worth. That's an insult, she said. Yes, which means it's not a genuine offer. It's the opening position of a negotiation he expects you to refuse so he can say he tried to settle it fairly. Yes, he said again. Or, she said, it's designed to see if you'll refuse in writing, so he has documentation of your position before he files anything. Rowan looked at her. Don't respond in writing, she said. I wasn't going to. I know. I'm saying it clearly so we've both said it. She sat down across from him. Have you heard back from the magistrate's office? Not yet. The letter went 3 weeks ago. You should have heard something by now. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. The magistrate for this territory has a reputation for being slow. How slow? Months, sometimes. She absorbed this. Then Barrett may be counting on the delay, filing pressure to buy while the magistrate process stalls. Probably. She looked at the letter on the table between them. The seal was a printed one. A legal office in Calford, not Barrett's personal seal, which meant he had already engaged legal representation, which meant he was further along in this than she'd estimated. "I want to see it," she said. He slid it across. She read it carefully. Legal language, precise and formal, the kind of language that was designed to sound authoritative rather than to communicate clearly. But underneath the language, the meaning was simple. Sell the pasture, or we will find a way to take it from you. At the bottom, under the attorney's signature, there was a handwritten line. Not from the attorney, from Barrett himself. She recognized the handwriting from nothing she'd seen before, but it had a quality, large, pressing hard, leaving impressions in the paper, that matched the man she'd met in the general store. The line said, "Tell the woman to think carefully about whose side she's on." She read it twice. Then she set the letter back on the table. Rowan was watching her. "What does that mean?" he said. "The last line." "It means," she said carefully, "that he intends to approach me separately." She kept her voice level. "He's going to offer me something, a position, probably. Something that makes it worth my while to encourage you toward the sale." Rowan went very still. "He thinks you can be influenced," he said. "He thinks everyone can be influenced," she said. "He thinks that because most people can be, which is how he's gotten as far as he has." She looked at the letter. "He doesn't understand what I am." "What are you?" Rowan said. She looked up at him. "I am the woman who reorganized your food stores and documented your survey boundary and stored your winter provisions and knows where your legal documents are and has been running the numbers on this operation for 3 months." She held his gaze. "I am the last person Clay Barrett should be trying to use against you." Rowan held her gaze for a long moment. Something moved in his face, something that was past the recalibration expression, past the slow updating of estimates. Something more direct than that and more difficult to look at without looking away. She looked away first, down at the letter. "Let him approach me," she said. "When he does, I want to know exactly what he offers. Because whatever he offers will tell us exactly how much he thinks the South Pasture is worth, which will be considerably more than 40%. "And then?" Rowan asked. "And then," she said, "we have the number we need when the magistrate finally gets around to asking." She picked up her coffee. She did not look at him again immediately. She was doing what she always did, which was redirect the energy of something large and uncomfortable into the channel of something practical and useful. What she was not doing, what she was refusing to do, was let herself examine too closely the thing that had moved in his face when she said, "I am the last person Clay Barrett should be trying to use against you." She was not doing that because she had read a letter she shouldn't have read, and it had reminded her of everything she was capable of misreading, and she was not ready to be wrong again about someone who had given her a warm room and a made bed and knocked on his own kitchen door. She was not ready. Outside, the winter pressed against the windows with its cold, indifferent weight, and the South Pasture lay under its cover of frost, and the creek ran beneath its thin skirt of ice, steady and cold, and going exactly where it had always been going. Barrett came for her on a Wednesday. She had expected it, had been expecting it since the letter with that handwritten line at the bottom, but expecting something and having it arrive are different experiences, and she felt the difference when she looked up from the cold cellar inventory she was doing and saw the rider coming across the yard. Not Barrett's men this time, but Barrett himself, alone, which was a deliberate choice. Men like Barrett understood the grammar of visits. Coming alone meant he wanted a conversation, not a confrontation. It meant he thought this was the kind of problem that could be solved with the right words directed at the right person. She set down her inventory sheets and wiped her hands on her apron and went to the back door. He dismounted at the yard fence, tied his horse with the particular unhurried quality of a man who is performing confidence rather than feeling it, which she noted because she had learned to read the difference. He walked across the yard and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. "Mr. Barrett," she said. "Rowan's in the South Pasture." "I know," he said. "I came to speak with you." She looked at him for a moment. Then she stepped back from the doorway. "You can come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on." She said it the way you say it when the alternative is letting someone stand on your porch and shout what they've come to say, which would be heard by whoever was within earshot, which was not preferable. Better to hear it inside where the conversation stayed contained. He came into the kitchen with his hat in his hands, which was a performance of manners, and sat at the table when she gestured at it, which was a performance of compliance, and she turned her back to him to deal with the coffee because she wanted him to know she wasn't afraid of turning her back on him. She wasn't. That was the honest thing. She had spent months working next to a man who didn't frighten her and living in a house that felt safer than any house she'd lived in before, and something about that accumulation had changed the way she stood in a room with someone like Clay Barrett. He was still unpleasant. He was still the man who had laughed in the general store and written that handwritten line at the bottom of a legal letter. But he was not, she had decided, someone she was going to be afraid of. "You've done well here," he said, looking around the kitchen. "It's a different house than it was." "It needed organizing," she said. "Mercer's a man who needs managing," Barrett said. "No offense to him. Some men are like that. Good at the physical work, poor at the systemic thinking." She set the coffee pot on the stove, turned to face him. "What did you come to say, Mr. Barrett?" He leaned back in the chair. Rowan's chair, she noticed, the one at the head of the table, and set his hat on his knee. "I want to offer you a position," he said, "managing my household and operations, the organizational work. What you've been doing here, but at a larger scale. My operation runs 6 times the head of cattle that Ash Hollow does. The work would be more interesting, and the compensation would be—" He named a figure. It was a real figure, not an insult, a genuine number, the kind that was meant to be taken seriously. She looked at him for a moment. "And in exchange," she said. "In exchange," he said, "you advise Mercer to settle the boundary matter quietly, before it goes to a magistrate and becomes costly and public for everyone." There it was, plainly said, which she gave him some credit for. He was not pretending it was a purely professional offer. "I see," she said. "It's a good offer," he said. "You're a capable woman in a difficult situation. You came here on a mail order arrangement and you've made the best of it, and I respect that. But you must see that your future here has limits." He spread his hands. "Mercer's not going to—" He stopped, adjusted. "He's a decent man, but he's not a man who commits, let's say. His late wife was here for 4 years before she passed, and the whole valley knew he never told her plainly how he felt until it was too late. You'd do well to consider whether that's the situation you want to find yourself in." She stood very still by the stove. He had said it carefully, not cruelly. Carefully. Like he'd thought about how to deliver it for maximum effectiveness rather than maximum pain, which was in some ways worse than cruelty because it meant he'd studied her situation and found the specific point most likely to yield. The thing was, he wasn't entirely wrong. That was the part that made her hands cold. "Thank you for the coffee," she said, though she hadn't poured it yet. "And for the offer. I'll think about it." He looked at her. He was trying to read her and not quite getting there, she could tell. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was processing something too significant to let show, the thing she'd developed over years of being in situations where showing too much cost too much. "Don't take too long," he said. "The magistrate matter will move forward one way or another, and the offer is significantly better before it moves than after." "I understand that," she said. He stood, put his hat on, looked around the kitchen one more time with the assessing eyes of a man who is always calculating what things are worth. "You've made this place into something," he said. "That's a skill that doesn't belong only to one property." He left. She stood by the stove until she heard his horse cross the yard and the sound of hooves diminished toward the road. Then she sat down at the table. In Rowan's chair, which she'd never sat in before, she put both hands flat on the table surface and looked at them. He's not a man who commits. His late wife was here for 4 years, and the whole valley knew he never told her plainly how he felt until it was too late. She thought about the letter in the cedar box behind the loose board. "Don't let the good of you rot in that house alone." She had told herself the letter was evidence of instruction, that Clara had asked Rowan to let someone in, and that Rowan's kindness to her was the fulfillment of that instruction rather than anything more personal. She had told herself this many times over the past weeks, and she had almost convinced herself of it. But sitting in the kitchen now with Barrett's words in the air and the cold coming through the walls and the coffee untouched on the stove, she thought, if he had been following instruction, why had he told her he was glad she'd answered the advertisement? Why had he said his mother would have liked her? Why did he say her name like it was something he'd decided he had the right to? She didn't know. She was sitting in his chair in his kitchen after 3 months of building something together, and she genuinely did not know what she meant to him beyond the practical, and that not knowing had become, in the weeks since she'd read the letter, a kind of low-grade ache that she was very tired of carrying around. And Barrett, who was a terrible man and a dangerous one, had nonetheless looked at her situation and identified the exact ache with the precision of someone who dealt in leverage for a living. She got up, poured the coffee she'd made, went back to her inventory sheets. She did not make a decision that afternoon. She was not ready to make a decision, but the offer sat in the room with her for the rest of the day like an object she kept having to step around. And when Rowan came in for supper, she did not tell him Barrett had been there. That was the first time she had not told him something. She noticed this fact. She did not know what to do with it. She did not sleep well that night, or the night after. The offer kept arranging and rearranging itself in her head in the way of things you haven't resolved. She'd examine it from one angle, and it looked like a threat. And then she'd shift the angle, and it looked like a genuine opportunity. And then she'd shift again, and it looked like both, which was probably the most honest assessment. Barrett was not a charitable man. He was offering her a real position because she was genuinely capable and because her departure would genuinely damage Ash Hollow, and both of those facts could be true simultaneously. She lay awake the second night with the east window letting in the cold moonlight, and she thought about a thing she had not let herself think about directly. She was still, technically, in a provisional situation. She had answered an advertisement and arrived at a ranch and been given a spare room and had worked very hard and had become something. Part of the operation, certainly. Something to the ranch hands, something maybe to the man in the room down the hall. But there had been no formal anything. She was not his wife. She was not hired help exactly. She had arrived under the mail order arrangement, which implied something more than employment, but had never been clarified into anything more specific. She was living in a spare room in another person's house and had told herself for 3 months that the accumulation of small acts of consideration was evidence of something solid, and she had read a letter she shouldn't have read and had let a man who specialized in leverage tell her that the thing she was building might be built on a man who could not commit. What if she was wrong? What if the kindness was just kindness, the particular kindness of a decent man following his late wife's instruction to let someone in, without that someone being specifically her, without it meaning anything beyond the general decency of the act? She had been wrong before. She had been wrong about Thomas with his wilted flowers and his schoolteacher's handwriting, and the cost of that wrongness had been the worst note she'd ever read. She sat up in bed. The moonlight on the floor of the spare room made a rectangle she had memorized without intending to. She knew this room now the way you know a room you've lived in. The creak in the left floorboard, the way the window latch needed to be lifted slightly before it would open, the direction of the draft when the north wind came through. She had made this room into something that felt like hers without ever being told it was hers. If she left, it would just be a spare room again. She lay back down and closed her eyes and told herself to sleep. And she did not sleep. And at some point in the small hours, she thought, what are you waiting for? You're waiting for him to say something he has not said and may not be capable of saying. You're doing the thing you have always done, which is wait for someone else to determine your worth, and then be destroyed when they determine it incorrectly. You know how this ends. She did know. She had known for a while, in the part of herself that processed things before she was ready to process them consciously. She had been building toward a particular kind of fear for weeks, and she had almost arrived at it. And what was on the other side of it was the action she didn't want to take, because taking it would mean accepting that she had been wrong again. She lay in the dark and breathed. In the morning, she got up and made breakfast and did not tell Rowan about Barrett's visit, and she hated herself a little for that. And she made the breakfast very well to compensate, which was the most dysfunctional trade she'd made in recent memory. No, the week that followed was the worst week she'd spent at Ash Hollow. Not because anything happened. Nothing happened, externally. The ranch ran. The cold held steady, The cattle were fine, the feed barrels were fine, the inventory was fine. She did her work, and Rowan did his, and they ate supper together in the evenings, and the conversations they had were practical and real, and sometimes almost easy. But she was carrying something he didn't know she was carrying, and that asymmetry made everything feel slightly off balance, slightly tilted, like a table with one short leg that you've put a book under to level it, but which shifts every time someone leans on it. On Thursday evening, a full week after Barrett's visit, Rowan came in from the south pasture with his coat carrying the smell of cold and cattle and something else, something like purposefulness, and he sat down at the table without removing his coat and said, "The magistrate responded." She set down what she was holding. "They've accepted the survey documentation and Dodd's testimony," he said. "They're opening a formal review of Barrett's boundary claim. It'll take time." The magistrate said 2 months minimum for the formal proceeding, but the certified copies were sufficient to initiate it. She sat down. "That's good," she said. "It's very good," he said. "Barrett can't make a move while the proceeding is open without it being entered into the record. He's essentially frozen." She nodded. She should have felt more. She had worked toward this, had spent weeks building the documentation that made this possible. But what she felt was mostly a complicated flatness, because the thing she'd been carrying all week had made it hard to feel the proportionate emotion about anything. He was looking at her. "What's wrong?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Mabel." He said her name the way he always said it, like a decision rather than a reflex. She looked at the table. "Barrett came here," she said, "a week ago, while you were in the south pasture." The silence that followed was the quality of silence she'd learned to read as him deciding something. "What did he say?" Rowan said. She told him. All of it. The offer, the figure, the condition attached to it, the careful, leveraged observation about Rowan's capacity to commit. She told him without inflection, in the factual mode she used when she needed to get through something that had too many live edges to handle carefully, and when she was done, she looked up at him. His face was doing the thing she couldn't fully read, the thing with multiple layers. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "I don't know," she said, which was the truth, and a more complicated truth than it appeared. "Are you considering it?" he said. "The offer." She held his gaze. "I've been thinking about what he said," she said. "Not the offer exactly. The other thing." A pause. "About me," he said. "Yes." He looked at the table, looked at his hands. The lamp burned between them in its usual steady way, and the house was very quiet around them, and outside the wind was doing the low baseline sound of a cold night. "He's not entirely wrong," Rowan said. Something moved in her chest. "Clara would have told you the same thing," he said, "that I'm not easy about saying things, that I hold back and call it not presuming, and it's really just—" He stopped. "Fear, probably, if I'm honest." "Fear of what?" she said, and her voice came out quieter than she'd intended. He looked up at her. "That if I say it plainly, you'll understand what you actually have here, and you'll decide it's not enough." He held her gaze, and there was nothing performed in it, nothing careful, just the direct, tired honesty of a man who has worked himself up to saying a hard thing and is going to say it. "That's not a good reason. I know it's not. But it's the true one." She sat with that, the lamp, his hands on the table, the cold outside. "There was never a spare room," he said. She looked at him. "Before you came," he said, "I moved my things into the small room at the back of the house, the warmest room, the one you have, the one with the east window, was mine. I moved out of it the week before you arrived because you had already been treated like a burden. I knew that from your letter I could hear it in how you wrote, and I wanted your first night here to be in the warmest room. I wanted it to feel like a place you'd been expected rather than accommodated." She did not move. "I should have told you from the beginning," he said, "but I thought if I told you it would seem like, I don't know, maneuvering, like I was trying to get credit for something that should just have been basic decency. So I called it a spare room, and I've been living in a 6-foot room with a window that faces a barn wall for 4 months. She looked at him for a long time. "Why are you telling me now?" she said. "Because you almost didn't tell me about Barrett," he said. And the reason you almost didn't is because you're not sure where you stand here, and you should be sure. That's my fault, that you're not sure. And I'm not going to let Barrett, of all people, be the one to define what this is because he misread it. She pressed her hands flat on the table, the old gesture, the steadying gesture. "What is it?" she said. "What is this?" He looked at her with the full weight of everything he'd been holding back for 4 months. "I think you know," he said. "I'd like you to say it," she said. "Plainly. I've been misread before. I need plainly." He held her gaze. "I don't see a woman who answered an advertisement," he said. "I see the woman who figured out my filing number from a county clerk's habit and walked a fence line in November without being asked, and kept the survey copies in a tin trunk under her bed without telling me until she was sure the information was safe." He paused. "I see the woman who made this house into a place I want to come home to. I see the woman who knocked on nobody's door when she arrived. She walked 3/4 of a mile in the dark carrying a heavy trunk because she'd learned not to ask for help. And I've been thinking about that woman every day since." She looked at him. "I didn't know what to call it at first," he said. "I told myself it was practical, that you were competent and the ranch needed someone competent. But that's not all of it, and I've known it wasn't all of it for a while." He took a breath. "You're not staying because I need a capable woman at Ash Hollow. I'm asking you to stay because I don't want to run this ranch without you specifically. Not someone competent. You, Mabel." The lamp burned. The wind came from the north in its slow, cold wave. Somewhere in the barn a horse shifted. She thought about Thomas's 7 words. She thought about the folded note in the wood stove. She thought about every room she'd ever been provisional in, every space where she'd arranged herself carefully around the edges of someone else's life. She thought about the east-facing window, the made bed, the knocked door, the heavy trunk picked up without comment. She thought about what it had cost him to sleep in a 6-foot room facing a barn wall for 4 months so that she could have the warmest room on her first night, and about the fact that he had not told her, had specifically not told her, so that it would not seem like maneuvering, so that it would just be what it was, care, offered without invoice. "You should have told me about the room," she said. "I know," he said. "I found the letter," she said. "Clara's letter, the one in the cedar box." He went very still. "I'm sorry," she said. "It wasn't intentional. I was organizing the utility room and it was behind a loose board and I read 2 paragraphs before I understood what it was." He was quiet for a moment. "What did you take from it?" "At first," she said carefully, "I thought your kindness was instruction, that you were following what she'd asked you to do. Let someone in, and that the someone was incidental and I'd made the mistake of thinking I was specific." "You're specific," he said, immediately. No hesitation. She looked at him. "Mabel," he said, "Clara asked me to stop hiding. She didn't ask me to invite anyone particular in. The advertisement was mine. All of it was mine. She just reminded me I was capable of it." She let out a breath she had been holding, she realized, for the better part of a week. "I need you to be patient with me," she said. "I've been wrong before about what kindness meant, and the cost of being wrong was very high, and I rebuilt from it, but not entirely without damage. I don't trust my own reading of situations the way I used to." "I know," he said. "I've been watching you not trust it for 4 months." She looked at him, surprised. "You do this thing," he said, "when someone does something kind for you. You receive it, and then you wait, like you're holding it at arm's length until you figure out what it costs." He said it without judgment, just observation. "I've been watching that since the first morning when you sat at that table and ate supper and didn't once relax your shoulders." She hadn't known her shoulders were doing that. She made a mental note to be angry about that later. "What do you want, Mabel?" he said. "Not what you're afraid of. What do you actually want?" It was such a simple question. It was such a devastating question. She could not remember the last time someone had asked her that in earnest, and the earnestness of it was what made it hard to answer because every defensive response she'd built over the years was built against cruelty or indifference, and she had no good structure against genuine, patient asking. "I want to stay," she said, "not because I have nowhere else to go. I want to stay because this is the first place I've been where—" She stopped, found the words. Where the expectation isn't that I become smaller in order to fit. Where my size is the thing that's incidental and everything else is the thing that matters. She held his gaze. That's what I want. I want that to be real and not something I've constructed because I needed it to be. It's real, he said. You have to know, she said, that saying that is easy. The hard part is the duration. I know that, he said. I was married for 7 years. I know what duration costs. She looked at him for a long time, at the tired, honest face across the lamp from her, at the man who had slept in a 6-foot room facing a barn wall for 4 months and not said a word about it. All right, she said. All right, he said. It was not a declaration. It was not a scene. It was 2 people in a kitchen at night arriving at a thing together after a long haul through difficult terrain, and it was imperfect and complicated and real, and that was exactly what it needed to be. She stood up and took his coffee cup and refilled it from the pot on the stove. When she set it back in front of him, their hands were close on the table and neither of them moved away. You should move back into the east room, she said. It's your room. No, he said. It's yours. I've slept in the small room for 4 months. My things are organized there now. Your things took up an afternoon to move in the first place, she said. I was here. He almost smiled. The full version this time. Not the edge of it, not the thing he put back quickly, but the actual thing. And it changed his face in a way that did something to her chest she was not going to examine too closely tonight. Keep the room, he said. It suits you. The window faces east, she said. I know, he said. That means you gave me every morning, she said. He looked at her and the smile faded into something quieter and more serious and more true. Yes, he said. That's what it means. She sat back down. The lamp burned between them. She picked up her coffee and he picked up his, and they sat in the easy silence that had been developing between them for 4 months, and which had a different quality now. Less careful, less provisional, less like 2 people being considerate of each other, and more like 2 people being simply together. Outside, the winter dark lay over Ash Hollow in its long, cold patience, and the south pasture fence line stood exactly where it had always stood, documented and witnessed and fixed, and the creek ran beneath its skin of ice, and the cattle in the barn were warm, and the feed barrels were full, and every jar in the cold cellar had a seal that held. She had built this. She had built most of it herself quietly, without announcement, and it had turned out, against every expectation she'd carried on that wagon west, that building something with someone who noticed you were building it was a completely different thing from building alone. She had not known that before. She knew it now. The lamp burned, the wind settled. Rowan turned his coffee cup slowly in his hands, the way he did when he was at rest, and Mabel watched him do it across the table they had shared for 4 months. And she let herself, carefully, deliberately, knowing the cost and choosing it anyway, believe. The morning after the kitchen conversation, Mabel woke before dawn and lay still for several minutes, just listening to the house. She did this sometimes, had done it since the first week, this particular practice of stillness in the early dark, taking inventory of the sounds before the day demanded her. The settle of the walls in the cold, the distant movement of cattle, the wind, which in December had a different register than it did in autumn, lower and more sustained, like something that had made up its mind. This morning she noticed something she hadn't let herself notice before. The house sounded like it was hers, not borrowed, not provisional, not a space she was occupying carefully around the edges of someone else's life. Just hers, in the simple, undefended way that spaces become yours when you stop waiting for them to be taken back. She got up, she dressed. She went to the kitchen and built the fire and started breakfast. Rowan came in from the barn at the usual time, stomping frost off his boots at the back door, and when he came through the kitchen and saw her at the stove, there was a moment, just a moment, where something in the quality of his presence in the room was different from every morning that had come before. Not dramatized, not performed. He came in and hung his coat and sat at the table, and it was the same as it always was, except it wasn't, and they both knew it wasn't, and neither of them made a thing of it. Cold last night, he said. Cold this morning, she said. She set the eggs in front of him and poured the coffee. He ate, and she ate, and the lamp burned, and outside the winter gathered itself for another day. I'm going to write to Barrett's attorney today, he said. Tell them formally that we're not selling and that any further contact regarding the South Pasture should go through the magistrate's process. Good, she said. You want to look at the letter before I send it? Yes, she said. He nodded, went back to his eggs. She watched him for a moment, the tired set of his shoulders, the way he wrapped both hands around his coffee cup for the warmth, and she thought about what he'd told her the night before, about the 6-foot room and the barn wall and the east window, and she thought that the specific gravity of a person's choices is sometimes not visible until they tell you what those choices cost them, and that it had taken 4 months and a threat from the wrong direction for him to tell her. She thought about what she had almost done, how close she had come to packing a suitcase again. The old reflex, leave before you're left, make the abandonment yours so it doesn't belong to someone else's cruelty. She had been very close to doing it. She had lain awake enough nights in this east-facing room, in the warmest room in the house, building the case for leaving. What she knew now, sitting at this table in the morning quiet, was that the case for leaving had never really been about Barrett or the letter or Rowan's difficulty with saying things plainly. It had been about fear. Her own, specific, well-earned, entirely reasonable fear that she had mistaken before and would mistake again. That she would build something and reach for it and find it was constructed of the wrong material and would not hold her weight. She had been building correctly this time. She had just not trusted her own hands. Rowan's letter to Barrett's attorney went out that afternoon. Formal, brief, unambiguous. The magistrate process was underway and Ash Hollow Ranch was not entertaining private settlement discussions. Further contact of this nature would be noted in the preceding record. She read it before he sealed it and suggested one change. A single sentence clarifying that the certified survey documents had been filed with the magistrate's office, which she thought was worth including because it told Barrett's attorney explicitly that they had the documentation and had formally lodged it, which foreclosed any strategy that depended on Rowan not having done that yet. Rowan read the suggested sentence, added it without argument. She sealed the letter herself, which was a small thing, but she noticed she did it. The reply came 11 days later. 3 sentences. The attorney acknowledged receipt of the communication, noted that his client would pursue the matter through the appropriate legal channels, and wished the parties a productive process. Rowan read it at the table and handed it to her. He's backing down from the private pressure, she said. For now, Rowan said. For now, she agreed. The magistrate process will take time. He'll look for other angles, but he's not going to get the South Pasture, not through a proceeding where we have certified documentation, witness testimony, and evidence of fence tampering. She set the letter down. He knows that. This is him adjusting strategy, not conceding. What's the next angle? I don't know yet, she said, but I'll be watching. Rowan looked at her for a moment. You like this, he said, the strategic part. She considered this honestly. I like problems that have solutions, she said, and I like having the information to find them. Whether I like the fact that Barrett is the problem is a different question. What's the answer to the different question? I'd prefer, she said, to be applying this particular skill set to something other than a land dispute with a bully. He almost smiled. What would you apply it to instead? She looked at her inventory sheets, which were spread on the table beside the letter. The spring planting schedule, she said. I've been thinking about the east field. The soil's been fallow 2 years. If we put in root vegetables this spring and rotate properly, by next autumn we'd have enough surplus to sell at the Hellers Creek market and reduce our dependence on Calford supply prices. He looked at her. You've been planning the spring already. It's December, she said. Spring planning in December is just being reasonable. He picked up his coffee cup, looked at the inventory sheets, looked at her. Show me, he said. She pulled the sheets toward him and walked him through it. The east field layout, the rotation schedule, the projected yield versus the current supply costs, the market days in Hellers Creek, and the prices she'd researched from the store ledgers she'd asked Mrs. Holt to let her look at. He listened with the quality of attention she'd come to recognize as genuine engagement rather than polite tolerance. He asked specific questions, pushed back on 2 of her yield projections with information about the east field's drainage that she hadn't known. and they revised the numbers together until they had something that was more accurate for being built by both of them. Outside the window, the winter sat on the valley, and the south pasture lay still under its frost. And in the kitchen, two people built a spring plan in December, because that was the kind of people they were. And it was, in its quiet way, the best conversation she'd had in years. January arrived with a cold that had genuine intention behind it, the kind of cold that tested every decision made in autumn about food storage and fuel preparation and livestock shelter. Mabel had planned for a cold winter. She had planned for the coldest winter in recent memory, on the principle that planning for the worst and experiencing the ordinary left you comfortable, while planning for the ordinary and experiencing the worst left you in serious trouble. She had not quite planned for what actually arrived. The temperature dropped in the first week of January to a level that made the cattle reluctant to leave the barn and made the water in the kitchen pipes freeze twice, and made the ground between the house and the outbuildings into a surface that required careful navigation to avoid falling. Wade fell on the fourth day and twisted his wrist, not badly, but enough that he was limited in what he could do for a week. And Chet developed a chest cough from the cold that she treated with what she had available and monitored carefully. But the stores held. The feed barrels were full and dry, and the oats were sound. The preserved food in the cold cellar was accessible and sufficient, and the sealed jars she'd worked through in October were doing exactly what they were supposed to do. She had put up enough in autumn that she wasn't rationing, not luxuriously, but without the anxiety that she knew came to poorly provisioned households in a hard winter. On the 9th day of the cold, Rabbit came to the kitchen door in the mid-morning and said, with his usual economy of expression, "Rider coming from the direction of Barrett's land." She looked out the window. A single rider, moving with some urgency. "Get Rowan from the south barn," she said. The rider turned out to be a man she didn't know. Young, in his 20s, working coat and working hands, and the particular look of someone who's been sent somewhere they're not entirely sure they should be going. He asked for Rowan, and when Rowan came, he took off his hat and said, "Mr. Barrett sent me. He's got a situation." "What kind of situation?" Rowan said. "His cold cellar failed," the man said. "Flooding from the creek back up. We didn't catch it until the water was already in. Took most of the winter stores." He held his hat in both hands and looked uncomfortable. "He's got 63 ranch hands and family on the property. The supply road to Calford is ice-closed. He asked me to ask if there's any possibility of—" He stopped, looked at the ground. "If there's any possibility of purchasing provisions," he finished, "at a fair price." Rowan looked at the man for a moment, then he looked at Mabel. She was already running the numbers in her head. 63 people. How long the road would stay closed? Probably 2 weeks minimum given the current temperatures. What Barrett's household consumed daily versus what she had stored in surplus above what Ash Hollow needed. She had the calculation done before Rowan finished looking at her. "We have surplus," she said. "We can help." Rowan held her gaze. He knew what Barrett had done. He knew about the offer, the leveraged pressure, the handwritten line at the bottom of the legal letter. He was letting her make the call, which was itself a thing she noted, a thing she would think about later. "Bring me a list of what your operation needs," she said to the rider. "Best estimate, 2 weeks of supplies for 63. I'll look at it against what we can spare, and I'll have an answer for you by this afternoon." The rider looked at her with an expression that was slightly stunned, as though he had not expected that answer. "Mr. Barrett," he started. "Tell Mr. Barrett that we'll help because it's a hard winter, and there are people on his property who didn't have anything to do with boundary disputes, and they need to eat." She looked at the man directly. "That's the only reason. He should understand that clearly." The rider nodded, rode back. Rowan stood beside her watching him go. "He won't like that framing," Rowan said. "No," she said. "But it's the honest one, and he knows it." She went back inside and started going through the inventory with the particular focus she'd developed for this. Systematic, clear-eyed, separating what they needed from what they could spare. She came up with a provision package that would cover Barrett's operation for 10 days, not 2 weeks, because she was not going to leave Ash Hollow short, but 10 days was enough to get them to a point where the supply roads might be opening or where Barrett could make alternative arrangements. When she had the numbers, she told Rowan, and he looked at the list and said, "This is generous." "It's practical," she said. "The alternative is 63 people on a neighboring property going hungry. That creates problems for everyone in the valley, including us." "You don't have to justify it," he said. She looked up from the list. "I know what you're doing and why," he said, "and it's the right thing." A pause. "I just want you to know I see it." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she went back to the list. What? Barrett came himself to collect the provisions 2 days later. He came with 3 wagons and 4 men, and he drove into the yard with the particular restraint of a man who has had to ask for help from someone he'd intended to use, which was costing him considerably. She was in the yard when he arrived, overseeing the loading of the first wagon with Chet and Rabbit. She had been specific about what went in which order, because the heaviest items needed to be loaded first, and she was not going to have her careful packing undone by someone who didn't understand how to stack a wagon for winter roads. Barrett got down from his horse. He looked at the loaded provisions. He looked at her. His face went through several things she could see him deliberately settling. He crossed the yard toward her. She stayed where she was, hands at her sides, watching him come. He stopped 2 feet away. The same distance as the first time in the general store, a lifetime ago in September. "Miss Ashcroft," he said. "Mr. Barrett," she said. He was quiet for a moment. The yard sounds filled in around them. The creak of wagon boards, Rabbit's quiet instructions to Chet about the grain sacks, the wind off the mountains. "I owe you an apology," he said, "and I'm aware that an apology under these circumstances is not worth a great deal, so I won't ask you to receive it as more than it is. But I behaved badly, and I used—" He stopped. Something crossed his face that was not quite discomfort, but was in the neighborhood of it. "I used information about your situation in a way that was designed to cause harm, and I'm sorry for it." She looked at him for a moment. He meant it. She could tell he meant it, which was slightly inconvenient because she had been prepared for him to not mean it, and it was easier to maintain a clear feeling about someone who didn't mean their apologies. "Thank you," she said, "for saying it plainly." He nodded once. Then he looked at the loaded wagons and at the provisions still being moved from the cold cellar, and he said, without looking at her, "You planned for this, the surplus." "I planned for a hard winter," she said. "I didn't plan for your cold cellar to flood." "No," he said, "but the result was the same." He was quiet for a moment. "You knew in September that a winter like this was coming." "I suspected," she said. "I didn't know. You can't know. You can only prepare as if you do." He looked at her then, really looked at her, not the appraising commercial look she'd received in the general store, but something more direct and less comfortable for him. "I underestimated you," he said. "Yes," she said. "You did." He accepted that without flinching. She gave him credit for it. "The boundary matter," he said, "through the magistrate. I intend to withdraw the claim." She kept her face neutral. "That's your decision to make," she said. "It's the correct one," he said, in the tone of a man who has been arguing himself to a conclusion for several days. "The documentation you filed is sufficient. And the fence tampering—" He stopped. "I didn't order that directly, but it was done by my men at my property, and I'm responsible for it. I'll notify the magistrate." She was quiet for a moment. "Rowan should hear that," she said. "Not from me. From you." Barrett looked toward the barn where Rowan had appeared in the doorway, watching. Barrett walked across the yard to him, and they talked for several minutes, quietly, while she went back to supervising the wagon loading. She didn't try to hear it. It wasn't for her to hear. When the wagons were loaded and Barrett's men were making ready to leave, Rowan came to stand beside her. She didn't ask what Barrett had said. He would tell her later, at the table, in the lamplight, the way they told each other things now, as a matter of course, as a habit of the life they were building. Barrett stopped at the edge of the yard before he mounted. He looked at Mabel across the distance of the cold morning. "The offer I made you," he said, loud enough to carry. "The management position. It stood on its own merit, separate from the other. The condition I attached to it. If you ever wanted the work, it was a real offer." She looked at him. "I know it was," she said. "But I have work here." He nodded, mounted. rode out with his wagons behind him. She stood in the yard and watched them go. Rowan was still beside her. After a moment, he said, "He's withdrawing the claim, formally in writing, to the magistrate." "Good," she said. "He's also going to submit a statement about the fence tampering, corroborating Dodd's account." She absorbed this. "That's more than I expected." "I think," Rowan said slowly, "that a man who's just had his winter stores flood and needed to ask his neighbor for help has a different view of what matters than he had in September." "Hard winters do that," she said. "Remind people what they actually depend on." They stood in the yard for a moment, the cold working at them from every direction, the south pasture visible over the fence line with its frost and its creek and its boundary posts exactly where they had always stood. "Come inside," Rowan said. "You've been out here an hour." She went inside. The magistrate closed the proceeding in February, 3 weeks after Barrett filed his withdrawal and corroborating statement. The south pasture boundary was formally confirmed as documented in the original survey. The creek access was Ash Hollows, as it had been for 11 years, as it would continue to be. The letter from the magistrate's office arrived on a Tuesday, and Rowan read it at the breakfast table and set it down and looked at her and said, "It's done." "Yes," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Just briefly. Not long, not with ceremony, just a hand covering a hand for a moment on a Tuesday morning in February. Then he went back to his eggs. She let herself have the feeling that produced for exactly as long as breakfast lasted, and then she got up to clear the table and start planning the day, because that was what you did. That was how you built a life. Not in the extraordinary moments, but in the accumulation of ordinary ones, each one added to the last like preserved jars on a cold cellar shelf. Each one a small act of preparation against whatever winter was coming. Spring came the way springs come after hard winters, slowly, with argument. The cold did not yield gracefully. It relinquished a degree at a time, grudgingly, interrupted by late freezes that killed the early growth twice before the ground finally committed to warmth in the 3rd week of March. She had planned for this too. The East Field planning was staged. She'd designed the schedule with the late freezes in mind, holding the most vulnerable starts until the soil temperature was reliable. Rowan had thought she was being overcautious when she'd explained this in December. By the second late freeze, he did not think she was being overcautious. "You knew," he said. "I didn't know," she said. "I planned for the possibility." "It's the same outcome." "It's a different philosophy," she said. "Knowing is passive. Planning is a choice." He looked at her for a moment with the expression that was no longer the recalibration look. She'd retired that name for it somewhere around January, when she'd started to understand that what she was seeing was not recalibration, but something more settled. It was the expression of a man who was paying attention and not sorry about it. The East Field went in by early April, root vegetables as planned, staged across 3 weeks, with a small section she'd designated for the kitchen garden. Herbs and greens that would service the household through summer and reduce what they needed to buy at the Hellers Creek market. Chet had developed over the winter a habit of consulting her on things that weren't strictly her domain: fence maintenance schedules, a question about one of the horses that was favoring a foreleg, the management of the hay supply as it got into the thinner end of winter. She answered all of it without making a point of it. It was practical and she knew the answers, and making a point of it would have changed the nature of the asking. One morning in April, Rabbit appeared at the kitchen door. His knee was better, improved through the winter by what she suspected was a combination of the wrapping preparation and the forced rest she'd insisted on, and said, "There's a woman at the gate. She doesn't look like she's got somewhere to be." Mabel dried her hands and went out. The woman at the gate was perhaps 45, with 2 children beside her, and a look on her face that Mabel recognized because she had worn it herself. The look of someone who has arrived at the end of something and is not yet sure if it is also the beginning of something else. She had a small bundle, and the children had smaller bundles, and they had the thin, exhausted quality of people who had been traveling or struggling or both for a while. "I heard," the woman said, "that Ash Hollow Ranch was a decent place. I heard there might be work." Mabel looked at her for a moment, then at the children, a boy who was perhaps 8 and a girl who was perhaps 6, both of them looking back at her with the careful eyes of children who have learned to assess adults quickly. "Come in," she said. "I'll put coffee on." She put coffee on. She gave the children bread and the remainder of the morning's eggs. She listened while the woman, her name was Nora Fells, and she had come from a situation that did not need to be described in detail for Mabel to understand its shape, explained what she could do and what she needed. She could cook and clean and sew, and she had some experience with kitchen gardens. She needed somewhere for herself and the children that was not where they had been. Mabel listened to all of it. Then she went and found Rowan in the south barn. "There's a woman at the kitchen table," she said, "with 2 children. She's looking for work and a place to stay." He looked up from what he was doing. "What kind of work?" "Kitchen and household." "She's capable. I can tell from the way she talks about it." He looked at her for a moment. "We have the bunkhouse room that's been empty since Dooley left in March," he said. "It's small, but it's sound." "She's not asking for large," Mabel said. "She's asking for safe." He held her gaze for a moment. She saw him understand the particular weight of that word in her mouth. "All right," he said. "Tell her she can start Monday. And tell her the room's available now if she needs it today." She went back to the kitchen and told Nora. Nora looked at her across the table with an expression that went through several things very quickly, and she pressed her lips together and breathed once hard and said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Mabel said. "Monday is real work." Nora almost smiled. "I know real work," she said. "I can tell," Mabel said. "That's why I went to ask." The children finished their eggs. The girl, who had not said a single word since they arrived, looked up from her empty plate and said, in a very small voice, "Is there more bread?" Mabel cut more bread. Later that evening, with Nora and the children settled in the bunkhouse room and the kitchen quiet, Rowan came in and she poured him coffee without asking, and they sat at the table. "She reminds you of yourself," he said. It was not a question. "A version of me," she said. "I had more options than she did. I had an advertisement to answer. She had a gate to stand at." He was quiet for a moment. "You're going to do this again," he said. "If someone else shows up at the gate." "Probably," she said. "We have room for it," he said, "if we're smart about the planning." She looked at him across the lamp. "We're planning the spring already," she said. "We can plan for this too." He nodded, drank his coffee. "She'll need to know the cold cellar system before autumn," he said, "if she's doing kitchen work." "I'll show her," Mabel said. When she settled, they sat in the ordinary, easy quiet that had become the most reliable thing in her days. Not always comfortable. They were 2 people with their own difficulties and their own habits and their own damage. And there were evenings when they were irritable with each other, and mornings when one or the other of them was distant in ways that took time to work through, and none of it resolved with the smoothness of a story that wasn't paying attention. But they worked through it. That was the thing. They worked through it the same way they worked through the fence tampering and the magistrate proceeding and the hard winter, with information shared plainly and the assumption that the other person could handle the truth. She had been waiting, since February, for the feeling of safety to reveal itself as provisional, for the floor to show the weakness she was sure it had. That was what her history had trained her to expect, that good things contained a hidden cost, that kindness always had an invoice somewhere that would arrive eventually, that a woman built like her did not get to keep the warm room. The floor had not given. Not yet. Not because it was perfect. It wasn't perfect. Nothing was perfect. The fence post still needed maintenance, and the magistrate fee had cost more than they'd budgeted, and Chet's chest cough had come back in March, and worried her more than she'd said. But because it had been built carefully, and on real ground, and by 2 people who both understood that building carefully was the only thing that held. She thought sometimes about the advertisement, the way she'd found it in the lending library, pushed between the pages of a women's journal. The way she'd stood in the aisle and read it 4 times before folding it clean and putting it in her pocket. She had not told anyone she was going. There had been no one to tell. She thought about that woman, the one who'd folded the advertisement and walked home through Cutter's Mill and begun writing a letter in which she described herself plainly, preemptively, because she had learned to name herself before someone else could name her wrong. That woman had not expected safety. She had expected, at best, a workable arrangement, and at worst, Another note on another morning that confirmed what she'd always been told about her worth. She had gotten something she did not have a word for in September. She had a word for it now, or the start of one, but she had learned to hold new words carefully and let them settle before she said them aloud. One evening in late April, Rowan came in from the east field with dirt on his hands and the specific satisfaction on his face of someone who has put seeds in ground they trust. And he stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at her where she was at the stove, and he said, out of nowhere, "I'd like to do this properly." She turned. "The arrangement," he said. He was holding his dirty hands away from his sides, in the particular awkward way of a man who started a conversation before he was ready for it. I don't want you to be here as a mail order arrangement. I want you to be here as mine, and I want to be yours, if you'll have me." He stopped, added, with the honesty that made her trust him more than she'd trusted anyone in years, "I know that's not a graceful way to say it." She looked at him across the kitchen, at his dirty hands and his uncertain face, and the specific, imperfect realness of a man who was trying to say something important without the language quite arriving in the right order. "It's a plain way to say it," she said. "Is plain enough?" he said. She turned back to the stove. "Move the pot to the cooler side so it wouldn't burn." "Yes," she said. "Plain is more than enough." He crossed the kitchen and washed his hands at the basin, and she set the table. And when they sat down to supper, it was the same supper they'd been sitting down to for months, but it was also entirely different. The way things that have been building toward a conclusion are different once they've arrived at it. Not resolved into simplicity, complicated things don't resolve into simplicity, they just become complications you've agreed to carry together. But arrived. Settled on the ground. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known in September. She knew that worth is not a weight, is not a dimension, is not the architecture of a body judged against a standard designed by people who benefited from the judgment. She had been told so many times in so many ways that her size was the primary fact of her, and she had believed it in the way you believe things that are shouted at you long enough, not fully, but enough. Enough to carry it west on a wagon. Enough to hold it while unpacking a tin trunk in a spare room in the dark. It was not the primary fact of her. She had always known this somewhere below the ribs, in the place where you keep the things you know but cannot prove to other people. Her capability was the primary fact. Her practical, systematic, exhausting, genuine care for people was the primary fact. The thing she had been offering the world her whole life, the organized pantry and the sealed jars and the careful inventory and the bread with the extra portion in the basket without announcement, that was the fact. That was her. She had needed to come 3/4 of a mile in the dark carrying a heavy trunk to find one person who saw that clearly enough to carry it himself without comment, without credit, without anything except the simple act of picking it up. People talk about being found, about being seen by someone who looks at you in the right way, and finally you are found. She had thought that was what she was looking for at 31 when she folded that advertisement, but that was not what had happened. What had happened was something more complicated and more true. She had found herself in the mirror of a person who reflected her back without distortion, and the finding was not a single moment in a kitchen or a gesture on a wagon road, but a long accumulation of Tuesday mornings and February supply calculations and East Field planting schedules and supper tables and a lamp that burned steadily between two people who had both, in their different ways, been living in spare rooms before they found each other. She had been the woman everyone left behind. She was no longer interested in that story. The east window faced the morning. The south pasture held its boundary. The cold cellar was full. Nora's children had, by the third day, stopped looking at adults with that careful assessing look and started just looking, the way children look when they're no longer calculating the odds of something being taken away. The spring came in. The seeds she'd staged came up in the order she'd planned, because good preparation is its own kind of optimism. The argument, made in the language of action rather than words, that the future is worth planning for, that you believe enough in your own continued presence to plant things you'll tend all summer and harvest in autumn, that you have decided, deliberately, to be here. She had decided. Standing at the east window on the last morning of April, watching the light come up over the field she'd planned since December, she understood that the greatest distance she'd ever traveled was not the 3 weeks in a wagon from Cutter's Mill to Heller's Creek. It was the distance between the woman who had stood at a wood stove burning a 7-word note and the woman standing here now, in the warmest room in the house, watching the sun come up on ground she intended to keep. She had walked that distance one meal at a time, one inventory sheet, one fence post, one sealed jar, one honest conversation in the dark. It had not been graceful. It had not been without cost. She had carried more than her heavy trunk on the road here, and some of what she'd been carrying she'd put down along the way, and some of it she'd keep carrying because that was the nature of damage. You don't finish recovering from it, you just get better at walking with it until it stops defining the direction you're going. The light spread across the east field and the new growth caught it, small and green and committed. And the morning bird in the cottonwood beyond the fence said something once, and the creek answered in its low, continuous way. And the house behind her held its warmth against the morning chill, and she pressed her hand flat on the window frame, the way she sometimes pressed her hands on surfaces to feel the solid, unargued fact of them. Here, still here, intending to remain. That was enough. That was, it turned out, everything.